I'm going to speak as slowly as I can because we do have language difficulties between the English and Americans. I mean, those of you who've listened to the tape that I gave of a speech to the Institute of Historical Review in Los Angeles will remember my opening remarks about the word homely and the fact that I had a great difficulty once when I had lunch with one of the directors of the National Archives in Washington, who produced his wallet after a time and showed me the photographs of his wife and children, and the wife looked very pleasant, a good cook, good-looking woman, a little bit plump, but congenial, a smile on her face, a kind of generally amiable, nice-looking person. And I said, "Is that Mrs. Wolfe?" And he said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "She looks very homely." Said, "Did you say homely?" I said, "Yes, Mrs. Wolfe looks extremely homely." Homely? And I said, yes, you get frantic. I said, "She is the most homely woman I have seen all week." Indeed, these are the problems that you have. I mean, my books are published very widely around the world. We have language problems in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Japan, and so on, of course. But the biggest problems I have are when my books are translated into American. My books are written in a kind of mid-Atlantic jargon. I have some there which are the War Between the Generals. It has the benefit or the disadvantage of having been edited by one of the finest editors in the world, a man called Tom Congdon, who in fact first made his name with editing Jaws, the famous book about the fish that terrorizes the village. And after I'd spent 15 years writing books, I first encountered Jaws, as I call Tom Congdon, and he taught me how to write again. All the silly little things about how to write things in sequence, that you don't say that he sat down having gone into the room. You've got to write he went into the room and sat down. Little things like that help to smooth the book so it reads mellifluously. But you have other problems. My Hitler book, Hitler's War, the famous biography I wrote, which was published in 1977, the major problem there was that the editor I had in New York, a man called Stan Hochman, Jewish but extremely pleasant, very, very nice, one of the nicest guys I've met, he would say things to me like, "David, on 20th of July 1944, after the bomb attempt on Hitler's life, you've got him sitting in your manuscript, you've got him sitting on the edge of his bed, feeling his pulse after the attempt on his life. The pulse was 73, he was very pleased, it was normal. And yet you've got him sitting on his bed in his shirt sleeves and braces. You can't do that. We're going to have to change that to sitting on his bed in his shirt sleeves and suspenders." Well, in England, suspenders are what you call a garter belt. And the idea of Hitler sitting on the edge of his bed after this traumatic attempt on his life, revealing to his staff that he wears a garter belt, this was out of the question. So the tyranny of the American language, I had to cut the sentence out altogether. Again, Ribbentrop, on one occasion, I say for the foreign minister von Ribbentrop, he had a skeleton in the cupboard. Stan Hochman, I'm sorry, David, that's going to have to be a skeleton in the closet. Now, in England, of course, a closet is what you would call a bathroom, which is what I look for when I want to have a bath, which is what the Australians call a dunny, and so on. I mean, you have this tyranny of the language. Far worse than the tyranny of the language, though, and this is something which a lot of you readers out there, I very seldom meet my readers, but a lot of you readers don't understand, is that the author is not the only person who decides what ends up in a manuscript. The lawyers have a say, of course. The editors have a say, of course. They tell you how many commas to put in and how to take out the semicolons, and they rewrite a page. A good editor will really rewrite a page probably 50 or 60 times, 50 or 60 minor changes per page of typescript, and it makes a better book out of it. But in the final analysis, there are subtle changes and shifts. They'll say things like, "David, I don't think you've made your point there about Hitler and the Jews, so we're going to have to change that. You mind?" And bit by bit, the book changes shape. I've got one example of that. When Winston Churchill wrote his very famous history after the war, the 6-volume history, the Second World War, it was published in America, of course, by the Time Life Corporation in a series, and marketed all around the world by them, which meant that when I went to New York and I looked in the papers of the Time Life Corporation, the chief editor, a man called Daniel Longwell, all his papers are now in the archives of Columbia University in New York, I found there the private correspondence between Churchill and Time Life at the time that he was writing this famous work of history. The Americans had sent editors over to England to Chartwell to sit side by side with the grand old Englishman, the greatest living Englishman as we called him, to help him write this book, and of course help him steer it in a certain way. because he was about 70 by then, and I must say that I hope that when I'm 70 I'm capable of writing a 6-volume work as big and as important as the one that Churchill wrote. But you can see the Americans gradually shifting the way the book is tilting, and Churchill trying to put things in and being prevented from putting it in, not only by the Americans but also by people around him. In the files of Time Life, for example, is a very illuminating exchange of correspondence between Churchill in 1947 and the German Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, who had been a Chancellor before Hitler. Around about 1928 and 1933, this Chancellor had sat in the highest office in Germany under the President and had watched with great apprehension as the Nazis came to power. And Heinrich Brüning, of course, had known full well who was behind the Nazis and who was financing them during their period in the wilderness. Very interesting question. Was it just the brown shirts? Was it the ordinary man in the street, the 6 million unemployed in Germany? Or who was putting up the money? And Brüning found out who was putting up part of the money to put Hitler into office. And in 1937, in fact, on August the 28th, 1937, Brüning wrote to Winston Churchill a letter about it. This was, of course, 4 or 5 years after Brüning had been tossed out of office. He'd taken refuge in England, he was in exile in Oxford, and he wrote a private letter to Mr. Churchill, who was also out of office in the wilderness, like himself, explaining to Churchill who had put up the money for Hitler, the sinister men behind the Nazi rise to power. And Churchill wanted to reproduce this letter, this 1937 letter, in his 6-volume work of memoirs. And you can look in vain in the memoirs, Volume 1 or Volume 2 or anywhere else, for that letter, because Brüning asked him after the war not to publish the letter, because it was so embarrassing and so painful. I quote the letter. In fact, Brüning wrote to Churchill in 1947 explaining why he didn't want the letter published. And that's the letter that's in the files of Time Life. He says, "I did not and do not even today, for understandable reasons, wish to reveal that from October 1928, the 2 largest regular contributors to the Nazi Party were the general managers of 2 of the largest Berlin banks. Both of, well, he goes on to explain what faith they were of, but I don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism, so I won't say what faith they were. These two people were. One of them was the leader of Zionism in Germany." So writes Brüning in his letter. How embarrassing in 1947 to have to explain that part of the money, a substantial part of the money behind Hitler, mysteriously and inexplicably came from these 2 Berlin bankers. Why? What was the point of it? We don't know, because Churchill bowed to pressure from Brüning. The letter was never published. Brüning, in fact, also reveals that a lot of the money for the Nazis came from French intelligence sources, from certain French arms factories, and that the guns that that were used for equipping the SA and the brown shirts and the SS in those early years before the rise to power largely were provided by Americans, by American arms firms, rather the same as the Americans are providing some of the weapons used by the IRA in Scotland today, in Ireland today. This is the kind of unknown side of the history of the war. And when you see things like that, it begins to make you think. What else is there that we don't know? And this is the kind of question that I've been asking myself ever since I started out to become a writer, all those years ago, 1963. In fact, before then, after I'd finished my university education, I went to Germany in 1959, as Paul indicated, and became a steel worker for a year in Germany, working on the furnace stage as an ordinary steel worker. It's a very unpleasant job. I'm sure that our gentlemen from Detroit in the next room know what an unpleasant job it is. You can see how brown the heat has burned them when you work on the furnace stage. It's a very hot place indeed. And I worked there for a year, and one of the men who shared the dormitory with me, dormitory was a tiny little room about this size, not much bigger than that table, with 5 beds in it. And 15 steel workers shared this dormitory on a kind of rotation basis. We each knew which shift we worked, and we each knew when we were allowed to use the bed. And the man who shared my bed, in the nicest possible way, was an elderly gentleman from Leipzig who had been in Dresden during the air raid. The Dresden air raid, the British-American air raid on Dresden on February the 13th, 1945. In fact, I know there's one survivor of that air raid in this audience tonight. The only person who survived from his entire school. He happened to be off school that day. He came up to me and bought a book from me, and he told me this. Just the same as we hear so often, I was the only survivor from my village. All the rest went to Auschwitz. So I was shocked when that gentleman in the steelworks told me that he had been in Dresden and he had seen himself what I didn't know anything about it. And when he told me that over 100,000 people had died that night, I was very, very shocked, and I thought to myself, here I am, I feel like a complete idiot. I'm an Englishman, 1960, and then a German is telling me something that we did to Germany which I've never heard of, 15 years after the end of the war. And I decided to write a book about it, which became a bestseller. It's still in print all the way around the world. I think it's sold about 2 million copies now, one way and another, and Macmillans of Canada still have it in stock, I know. The Destruction of Dresden. And that book became a bestseller, so I decided not to worry about getting a PhD or getting a degree or any kind of further university education. I was studying political University College. I decided to become a writer, become a historian. Why not a kind of historical journalist, to do more books like that. This is the advantage. If you've had one bestseller, which the newspapers around the world picked up and serialized, all around the world they went wild over this book, because I reproduced the photographs in that book. Photographs of bodies, heaps of bodies, 600 or 700 at a time, being heaped up and set on fire in open-air mass funeral pyres in Dresden in the city centre, which, incredible, inconceivable. They were not the photographs that had been reproduced before. And so I became a writer. I remember I wrote a string of books after that. I wrote a book and I had a baby, and I wrote a book and I had a baby, and I wrote a book, and all daughters, 4 books. And then I ran out of steam completely, and I just wrote books after that. It was a serious business, and my publisher said to me at the end of the first book, he said, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "Mr. Kimber, the next book I'm going to write, I want to spend a long time, perhaps 5 years even, writing a biography of Hitler, using the same techniques. Let's find out if we've been lied to about him as well." And the book eventually took 10 years to write. I spent a great deal of time talking to all Hitler's surviving staff members, his secretaries, the private people who had worked with him, the colonels, the ADCs, the generals, the field marshals, persuading them to dig out of their files and the hidey holes and hiding places all their private diaries and letters. And eventually, at the end of 10 years' work, I had produced the book which I consider, in my immodesty, to be probably the standard work on Hitler, which is gradually displacing all the old hackneyed versions about that man. And again, I was seriously alarmed as an Englishman to find that a lot of what we had been told about him was lies. And I asked myself why it was lies. And the answer really is, it was lies because Churchill had done the lying. This is natural. We were fighting a war, and in wartime you do lie. You do tend to set up a great big subsidiary auxiliary army of lies to help your soldiers of the truth fight forwards. Or as Winston Churchill himself put it in his inimitable oratory style, he said, "The truth is so fragile that it needs a bodyguard of lies to protect it." Winston Churchill. And he provided the bodyguard himself. He was our most outstanding liar, and he continued to do the lying long after the war had ended, because he had to. How could we admit, how could Churchill admit, how could any of his cabinet admit that the war had been a pointless journey from 1940 onwards? That in fighting the war from 1940 onwards, we British had ruined the British Empire. We'd bankrupted ourselves, we'd caused immense carnage throughout Europe, we'd destroyed most of Europe's most beautiful cities, we'd killed 20 million people, and we'd bankrupted our own empire. How could we admit it? We had to pretend it was all worthwhile. And I must say, if I may make this very small side excursion, that having spent the last 5 weeks at the behest of the organizers of this speech as well this evening, evening for evening, I've been in a different city around the world, a 35,000-mile tour, in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Western Canada, and now here. Every evening I've been speaking in a different city. And I must say that from what I have seen of this British Empire tour, the white man, and the British in particular, have no reason to hang their head in shame. We have done magnificent things over the last 200 or 300 years, and I'm very, very proud of what we have done. So in no way what I'm saying this evening can possibly be regarded as anti-British in any sense. What I'm trying to do is detract from a central part of the British legend, namely Winston Churchill himself, and the war he fought, and whether it was a true and a just war. You see, when you fight a war, you do use lies. Churchill was the biggest liar. What is rather like a flywheel begins to spin. It's set in motion by the propaganda ministerium, by the propaganda officials, whatever they're called. In England they were called the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. Some of our most important subsequent politicians, like Richard Crossman, were leading figures in PWE, and they set out the lies that persuade the soldiers that the war is worth fighting. And they create the war aims for the soldier. We British, we never had war aims, of course. We went into the war ostensibly because of Poland, but by 1939, by the end of that year, of course, that war aim had completely vanished. Poland had gone up the spout or down the tubes, whichever the way you care to look at it, and invaded from the east by the Russians, from the west by the Germans. Poland as such had ceased to exist. By the spring of 1940, really, the war had no further point. So Churchill, when he became Prime Minister, set up the big lie that the British Empire was endangered, that Hitler planned to attack the British Empire, that he was going to invade Britain, and then this made the war of great import for Britain. We had to fight, otherwise it meant perdition and oblivion for ourselves. Of course, the Americans weren't interested in preserving the British Empire. Quite the opposite. We find out that President Roosevelt was saying in the spring of 1942 that his great dream and ambition is the destruction of the British Empire, beginning with India. He says that in a cabinet meeting in May 1942, and one of his secretaries of state, the vice president, in fact, Henry Wallace, wrote that down in his private diary. The destruction of the British Empire was the president's aim, and that man was our ally. How extraordinary. And yet we find at the same time now in the German papers, the secret German records of the time, and also pale reflections, pale echoes in the British papers, we find that at the same time Hitler was telling us, both before the war and during the war, right through 1940, indeed right through to May 1941, the famous mission of Rudolf Hess, Hitler was telling us that he had no aims against the British Empire at all. No desires, no wishes, no claim on the British, although we declared war on him. He wanted, in fact, the British Empire to remain as a great force for world civilization and stability. He said in private, as I know from his private staff, again and again, what point would there be for me to destroy Britain now or to attack London, the heart of the British Empire? If I destroy Britain, as I can, the only beneficiaries, the people who will make benefit from the British Empire will be the Americans and the Japanese. And what purpose have I got in wasting good European blood to benefit those two races? Again and again he said, both in private and through intermediaries to the British, that he wanted to help the British Empire, even after the war had begun. He sent secret people across, he sent messages, he approached the ambassadors of the British in their various far-flung capitals and said, I make no claim on Britain or the British Empire. I am prepared to withdraw the German forces from Poland and Czechoslovakia, apart from the territories that, of course, the whole war was about in the first place, the former German territories that he had recovered. He was going to withdraw his armies from France. Of course, he wanted a free hand in the east, but why should that concern us? What concern had we to protect the peoples of the Ukraine or elsewhere in the east? This was entirely a matter, in my opinion, between Uncle Joe Stalin and Hitler. And if Hitler fell upon Uncle Joe Stalin, then as far as I'm concerned, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. But of course the trouble was that we were being told something completely different in England. We were told that Hitler was determined to destroy Britain and the British Empire. This was the great lie that Churchill set up, and it through until the end of 1941, when of course the Americans came in, who were not concerned with preserving the British Empire. In fact, they were quite frankly telling Churchill that we weren't going to get Hong Kong back, we weren't going to get Singapore back, we weren't going to get India back. None of this was going to be returned to us after the war. The Americans were bent on destroying it. So gradually and imperceptibly, a third war aim emerged, rather like two television pictures, one melting into the other. And by the end of the war aim has become fighting the devil incarnate, fighting the man who did all this. And all this, of course, we didn't know what it was at the time, but lo and behold, when we marched into Germany, we found what all this was. It was Bergen-Belsen, it was Dachau, it was Buchenwald, it was the awful pictures of bodies of emaciated, starved, infected people being bulldozed into lime-filled pits by British Army bulldozers in the concentration camps. Of course, nobody claimed that this kind of starvation, this kind of killing or death on this scale had been going on throughout the war in those camps, but this was the picture that was put to the British in the newsreels, in the cinemas, in the newspapers. Vivid, ghastly pictures which seemed to justify, in retrospect, by their sheer bedazzlement, the war that we had fought. Suddenly it all seemed worthwhile because we saw what had been going on in Germany. And nobody asked logical questions like, surely all this kind of death on this scale only happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Or, if people died of typhus and starvation in Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, then possibly weren't we British and Americans partly responsible because we deliberately produced the chaos and the conditions behind the German lines that led to starvation and typhus epidemics, because we deliberately bombed the pharmaceutical factories, we bombed the bridges, the railroad lines, the autobahns, to prevent the transportation of food from one part of Germany to another. But of course those are logical questions, and in the heat of an aftermath of a bloody war, you don't ask logical questions. You're out for revenge, you're thirsting for revenge. But now 40 years have passed. So surely after 40 years, we should be able to look around and ask logical questions. Logical questions, however, are the questions that professors can't ask and politicians try to prevent. You see, there's a certain grisly logic in all this. Our paid professors of history can't do the research which I, as an untrained plain mister, can do. You see, I'm not a professor, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm not even a lord like Fuchsia Baroka is now. I'm just plain mister, and I'm rather proud of it. Because I have to support myself entirely by the books that I sell. like the ones on that table there. If I don't sell books, then I can't pay my bills and I can't keep on writing the next book. But if I write a bad book, or if I write 2 or 3 bad books, with the boobs in it, which the newspapers pick out, which I'm ashamed to admit are probably right, then of course the time comes when publishers turn their back on me and say, Mr. Irving, I'm sure it's a very interesting book, but try another publisher this time. And you end up out in the cold again. I've got to be a bit more careful in the way I do my research than the average university professor who rests on his academic title, who says, how dare you impugn my integrity as a historian, I am Lord Dacre. And we saw what happened to Hugh Trevorrow over the Hitler diaries. He fell flat on his face when I stood up in the press conference in Hamburg on the day of their publication and announced that they were fake. You may have seen what happened. When I announced that those diaries were fake, in the middle of the press conference, the magazine that was actually launching them onto the world markets, I had been smuggled in their midst by a rival newspaper that morning, much to my delight. When I announced that they were fake, and I'd asked the 4 important questions like where is the ink test, the paper test, the glue test, and the how do you explain that Hitler is actually shaking hands with Mussolini with his left hand on the day of the bomb plot because his right hand is so badly damaged, and yet your diaries he apparently continues to write that evening with no change in his handwriting. That's when they cut off my microphone and had me thrown out of the press conference, right into the arms of the NBC team who were waiting to put me on either Good Morning America or the Today Show, I forget which it was. So within only a few minutes I was speaking to 20 million Americans with all the documents proving the fakes. I like being plain mister, and I let the professors run around in circles trying to establish the truth by cribbing from each other. You see, this is the way the Americans and the Germans and the British historians do it. They can't afford the research that I do. The Germans least of all, because a German writer who writes a book, his book stays in the German language and is very, very seldom translated into other languages. So if his publisher, Ullstein or Propylaen or the Deutsche Verlagsanstalt, says, I'm sorry, Professor so-and-so, but what you've written isn't exactly nice, is it? Would you mind changing that paragraph? He clicks his heel and says, to a fail. Yes, of course, what do you want me to change? The German publishers who got my Hitler biography, Ullstein, they did that. They refused to let me see the proofs. They refused to let me see the manuscript of the translation. I had to wait to buy my own book in the Munich bookstores on the day it came out. And I saw they changed everything. All my hypotheses, all my theories, all the facts that I'd found out over 10 years of writing, they'd changed without telling me. They'd written in paragraphs of their own, all fitting in, of course, with the modern German hypotheses. And when I protested about some of this months earlier, they said, but Mr. Irving, these extracts you give from the Canaris diary and things like that, they're completely unfamiliar to our historians. We've shown it to 2 or 3 of our historians, and they say they're completely unfamiliar with them. And so, frankly, your sources are rather suspect. To which I said, I've worked 10 years on this man, and we have these pages of the Canaris diary in the Cabinet Office files in England. That's why your German historians haven't seen them. They said, well, unfortunately, too late, we've cut them out. On publication day in Germany, I banned my own book. I sent a telegram to Ullstein saying, you will print no more copies of this book, and you will withdraw all copies from circulation. They had to do so. And for 8 years, I fought a legal action to get the rights back, and the book is now being published in Germany, finally, in the right form. But could a German professor afford to do that? Of course not, because that would ruin him. Needless to say, I spent the next 10 years, since 1975, writing a Churchill biography. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but suffice to say that in America, the publishing house Doubleday has tried to do exactly the same. They've asked for all the money back, all the advance. They said, Mr. Irving, you found out things about Mr. Churchill that the American reading public does not wish to be told. So would I ever pay $100,000? And I said, get lost. Pay the money back, but I'm going to write the book, the truth as it really is. You see, I'm not interested in writing history the way the professors do. They don't have time to go to Stanford University in California, to Moscow, to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, to Poland, to look in all these foreign files and try and find out the truth. And it costs a lot of money, of course. They don't have the time, they don't have the interest. Why do it if you can buy 20 books on Winston Churchill and write number 21 and nobody will notice? Particularly if you're a wonderful writer and your style is good. Or you buy 10 books on Adolf Hitler and write number 11. It's what I call the X+1 method of writing history. I don't do that. Because what's the point? One's own life is too precious. One wants to produce something original. All these professors do. Along comes Professor Jakobsen in Cologne, in Bonn, and he writes a particular theory. And along comes Hillgruber in Cologne, and he quotes what Jakobsen has said. And then comes Professor Jekyll in Stuttgart, who incidentally said that the Hitler diaries are genuine, and he quotes what Hillgruber and Jakobsen have said. And so you've got 3 professors all saying the same thing. And it looks like 3 independent sources, because they're all called professor. And then along comes Professor Brochard, a famous name in Munich, and he quotes what Hilgruber, Jekyll, and Jacobson have said before him. And there's 4 sources. And so it goes on. 4 dogs chasing each other's tail around and round in a circle, not ever getting close to the center where the truth is. 5 dogs, 6 dogs, these professors, the circle gets bigger and bigger. It's like a little soap bubble. It gets bigger. They puff hot air into it. And the soap bubble, on the end of this pipe, they're blowing hot air into it. And more hot air goes in, and this soap bubble gets more and more technicolored and multicolored, like Jacob's jacket. So you put in more and more color and detail, and it begins to wobble. It becomes unstable the way that soap bubbles do. It is just calling out to some idiot to come along and prick it. And I'm that prick. Soap all over their faces, or egg over their faces, as we say in the modern idiom, and all they can say is then Irving is a fascist, he's a neo-Nazi, arrest him, don't let him into Vienna, for God's sake, he's done enough damage in Germany as it is, and so on. And enough to say that this is for the German members of the audience, when President von Weizsäcker recently said in his speech before Christmas that he had been receiving letters from all over Germany protesting about the incarceration of Rudolf Hess, 92 years old, 46 years in prison, 18 years in solitary confinement. This is my fault, because I've spoken 60 times in Germany protesting about the Rudolf Hess case and advising people to speak to von Weizsäcker, to write to him and protest about it. And when they protested to von Weizsäcker, he got these letters over Christmas, he said in his broadcast, but of course Hess deserved it, because of course he was a war criminal and crimes against peace and the rest of it. And I spoke at a big Munich beer cellar 2 months ago, the Löwenbräu beer cellar, to 3,000 Germans, great fun. And I said, I hear rumors that some of the letters were not addressed to Herr Ernst von Weizsäcker, but to Herr Ernst von Speichellecker. You don't know what it means. In German, Speichellecker means Herr Lickspittel. And I said that the rumor is that the German Federal Post Office knew instantly whom to forward the letters to, and that they were all delivered to the presidential palace. You can have great fun with the German language. No. You see, the professors, they can't find out what the truth is because they're just running around in circles and they don't get near the documents. But I took the trouble to interview the people. For example, I went to Weizsäcker's mother. President von Weizsäcker's mother is the widow of the number 2 man under Ribbentrop in the foreign ministry. When I visited her on Lake Constance near Switzerland, oh yes, I've got my husband's diaries and letters. And I said, your husband, the 2nd man in the German foreign ministry, you've got all his letters and diaries. She said, yes. Do you want to use them? I said, why haven't you given it to the German historians? She said, because you're the first one to ask for them, Mr. Irving. None of them bothered to come and see me. And it was the same with Walter Havel. Walter Havel, who was the top liaison officer between Ribbentrop and Hitler, on Hitler's staff. He had been in prison with Hitler. He committed suicide with Hitler on the same day. You can hardly imagine somebody who was closer to Hitler. I found his widow. She'd married again, living in Bielefeld, had a different name, but I found her. And after 5 hours of buttering her up, over tea, she eventually came out with these private diaries of her husband. She said, oh yes, I did mention, well, all right, now I've talked to you, I'll admit I got all my husband's diaries. Are you interested? I said, it's the same. I just gasped. She gave me the 1941 diary straight away to take back to England to have a look at. I said, why do I get it? She said, because nobody else has bothered to visit me, Mr. Irving. You're the first one to come and see me and ask about my husband's diaries. I've got a page of it here. June the 2nd, 1941. You can't see it, it's very bad. There's a negative Xerox copy of the copy that she gave me some years ago. But the last line, 2nd of June 1941, as a private man, I would never break my word. This is Hitler speaking to Havel, just before he attacked Russia. As a private man, als Privatmann würde ich niemals mein Wort brechen. Als Politiker für Deutschland aber, wenn es notwendig ist, 1000-mal. As a private man, I would never break my word, but as a politician for Germany's sake, if necessary, 1,000 times. You see, this diary is absolutely vital. And that's why private diaries are worth their weight in gold. You'll find this in a minute when I mention the private diary of a wife of Mr. Churchill's entourage. You see, Churchill, during the pre-war years, rather like Hitler before 1933, was in the wilderness. He had been a cabinet minister, he had been First Lord of the Admiralty in the Great War, the First World War, during which time he had masterminded such great triumphs as Gallipoli and the Dardanelles campaign, where my father fought, incidentally. But then, in the interwar period, he had rather gone downhill, and he began to suspect that he was out of office for good. And for 10 years, in fact, from 1930 until 1939, he was in the wilderness. He had no office. He was just an ordinary member of Parliament earning £500 a year. £500 a year wasn't very much money in those days, and it isn't very much money now. But he had huge expenses. He had this house, this country house, Chartwell, He had 42 gardeners, secretaries, nurses, governors, chauffeurs, and all the rest of them support somehow out of this £500 a year that he earned as Member of Parliament. So he did various things to pick up extra money. One of them was he faked paintings. Well, I mean, don't we all? When we need money, we go around doing oil paintings and signing the name of a famous master on them, like Picasso or something else. We don't all do that. Churchill did. I only found out about this by chance when my publisher in London, William Kimber, he telephoned me and says, David, do you know the name that Winston Churchill painted under as a painter, what his nom de plume was? And I said, well, yes, it was Charles Morin. He said, yes, but I've got a Charles Morin hanging in my corridor. I said, you can think yourself lucky, you've got a Churchill. He says, no, the one I've got is by the famous French post-impressionist painter, Charles Morin, who died in 1906. They're worth quite a bit of money. So I say, you mean there was a real Charles Morin? He said, that's what I'm getting at, David. Now, this is a very, very established English publisher who would never dream of saying anything about Churchill. But gradually the penny had dropped. That in the 1930s, when Churchill ran out of money, he sent some of his famous paintings, which you've all heard about, across the water to Paris, had them put on display in a little-known gallery in Paris, and painted onto them the name of a well-known French post-impressionist painter to increase their price. And one person found this out, President Roosevelt. I know this because working in the Roosevelt files in Hyde Park, New York State, I came across an unpublished file of correspondence in the back of the safe, so to speak, which isn't included in any of the volumes of published Roosevelt-Churchill letters. And it came about like this. When Churchill made his first visit to Washington after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it was announced in the press that he was there, and the chairman of the American Fine Arts Commission, who knew about the Charles Morin scam, wrote a letter to Churchill at the White House, addressed not to Mr. Churchill, but to Monsieur Charles Morin, care of the White House, Washington. I mean, a very nice little joke, but the trouble was it didn't reach Churchill because it had to go through this rather ponderous, leaden-footed White House mailroom who didn't know anybody called Charles Morin staying at White House. He wasn't opened until February 1942, and immediately sent up to Roosevelt because it was quite plain who it was about. Roosevelt in the letter actually says, dear Monsieur Morin, we're very happy to hear that you're not dead, as we had presumed from the biographers, but you're very much alive and well, and you're visiting Washington. We admire some of your works, though not all of them. Would you like to come round to a coffee party? Which, of course, given Mr. Churchill's reputation for sobriety, cannot have been much of an attraction. Would you like to come round to a coffee party when we can discuss the matter further? And Roosevelt read this letter, and gradually the penny dropped. And he got in touch with the American Secret Service and said, just check out what name Churchill himself used when painting. And he found out all the background and the fact that Churchill had faked these paintings. And Roosevelt wrote a letter to Churchill in February 1942, which I've got, saying, I'm frightfully sorry, I hope I haven't caused trouble, but I actually asked Scotland Yard if they were aware of the real identity of Monsieur Charles Morin before I realized it was you yourself. And I hope I haven't caused you any trouble, Winston. There's a nice little stranglehold that Roosevelt got over Winston by this method. The letter is there in the files. Faking paintings was not Churchill's only source of income in the pre-war years, you'll be interested to hear. When he became very short of money, which was at the beginning of the 1930s, he did little tasks like writing War and Peace, Crime and Punishment, Jane Eyre, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Wuthering Heights. You think you've heard these titles too, don't you? Well, you have, because of course they're very well-known books. War and Peace by Tolstoy, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, and so on. Churchill's job for the Chicago Tribune North American newspaper syndicate was to rewrite these books in 25 pages of foolscap typing with double spacing, about, 10,000 words each, for the Chicago Tribune syndicate to print on one page of the newspaper on a Sunday, and he got $1,000 a time for doing this. Not a very honourable job, but he did it, and he did it very well. His digests of these great works are extremely good. The records on that are in Eugene, in Oregon, in the University of Oregon, where all the records of that particular syndicate are there, including the manuscripts corrected in Churchill's own hand. All this is harmless. In fact, I even allow him to go around faking a painter's signature, because that cannot be said to have upset his political alignment. But in the middle of the 1930 wilderness period, he started accepting what I would call slush money. It came about like this. A pressure group was set up, a secret pressure group called the Focus. And Churchill was the center of this group called the Focus, which consisted initially of about a dozen top-ranking British dissident politicians, people who were out of office and wanted to get back in and were willing to go to any lengths to do it, including overthrowing the government of Neville Chamberlain or Baldwin, overthrowing that government and putting Winston Churchill in their place. It became his vehicle, this group called the Focus. Initially they were set up by a kind of loose conglomerate of the Trades Union Congress in London, the American Jewish Congress in New York, and associated bodies in London. What is significant is that it really started to become active in the middle of 1936, in July 1936, with a huge fund set up by the Board of Deputies of British Jews in London. Now, these are facts. I mean, I'm not inventing this. The evidence comes actually from the authorized biography of the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, a man called Sir Bernard Whaley Cohen, a very famous English Jewish family. He was, in fact, a chairman of the British Shell, I think, at that time, or BP, or one of the big oil companies. And he had a dinner party on the night of July the 29th, 1936, at which he passed the hat round for the Focus. And the number of city financiers who crawled out of the woodwork for this dinner party in Hampstead and North London to Whaley Cohen's flat, they wrote out cheques on the spot for £25,000 for the Focus, backed up by a promise of another £25,000 when that lot ran out. In other words, £50,000, a huge sum of money in 1936, multiplied by 40 to get Canadian dollars today. And you see how much money this group put up for the Churchill secret group, the Focus, in July 1936. The price was small because Churchill was, by that sum of money, bought. He was hired. He became a hired help. My chapter of my Churchill biography in which I deal with this extraordinary situation is called The Hired Help. The only thing he was asked to do was to realign his gun and point his cannon securely on Nazi Germany. Germany had to be the only target of Mr. Churchill in the future. Forget about India, forget about colonial policies, forget about unemployment at home. He had to attack only Nazi Germany. That was what he was being hired to do. And he was a brilliant orator, a wonderful speaker. He used all his powers of colourful language to bring the gun to bear on Nazi Germany from that point on. Writing articles in the great national newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, the Evening Standard, they all hired him. And of course he was getting money the whole time from the people who were backing the Focus. I know who the members of the Focus were. You won't find anything about the Focus if you read Churchill's history work. You won't find anything if you read about the Focus if you read the other great books on that period. Because Churchill himself wrote to the man who was the secretary of the Focus, called Eugen Speer, a German emigrant who came to England in the mid-1930s, very wealthy a German emigrant who came to England, and whom Churchill rewarded in 1939 and 1940 by locking up and sending off to Canada as an unwanted alien. But by that time, of course, he had done his bit in setting up the Focus for him. Eugen Speer. Speer's papers are now available. Speer wrote a little book about the Focus, a little brochure. And right at the beginning of the brochure is a letter from Mr. Churchill to Speer back in the 1940s saying, "Dear Mr. Speer, I would be very grateful if you give me your word that you will never publish what you plan to publish about the Focus in my lifetime. After my lifetime, I don't mind so much." Very interesting that Churchill was in a way ashamed about this. In fact, Churchill writes to Randolph Churchill in one letter saying, "I'm perfectly well aware of who are the people behind the money that is being pumped into my group now, and I'm aware what this involves." There's a rather sinister letter that Churchill admitted in a letter to his son Randolph Churchill at the time. The Focus. The files of the Focus are now gradually becoming available. Largely, we can reconstruct them, as we often have to, not through the central file itself, but through the mirror image and the files of the members of the Focus. One of the principal members of the Focus was, for example, General Edward Spears, Conservative Member of Parliament for Carlisle in Britain, a Tory Member of Parliament. His papers are now available in the archives, and if you know what to look for, and you know the various code names under which the Focus ran, like the Anti-Nazi Council for Peace and Freedom was one of its code names, but they always referred to themselves in secret as the Focus. You can see how it operated right from that time in 1936 until the outbreak of the war. With the outbreak of the war, of course, Churchill had been levered into office as the First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Focus suddenly becomes of no interest to him at all. He dumps it like an unwanted horse, like an old nag he doesn't need anymore. But it is not without significance to see how the people in the Focus and how Churchill himself financed themselves during those final years in the wilderness before the war broke out. Because it explains how the great lie began. I've explained who put up the money in the middle of 1936. That money continued to trickle along until the outbreak of the war, but Churchill's financial problems grew worse and worse. Not just because of the cost of running his house, Chartwell, which was the apple of his eye, but because of Randolph Churchill's gambling habits, which his father had to pay, sometimes £1,000 at a time, huge sums of money in modern currency, multiplied by 40. In February 1938, just as the Austrian crisis is boiling up, the first great major political crisis in Central Europe, in February 1938, Churchill got a letter from his London stockbrokers, Vickers da Costa, one of the biggest stockbroking firms in London, who were handling his share account. They wrote to him saying, "Dear Mr. Churchill, we regret to have to inform you that all your American stocks and shares have become valueless overnight through a collapse on the American stock market. You owe us £19,600. Will you please take immediate steps to rectify this situation?" It's like a bank manager writing to any of you about an overdraft. You've got an overdraft suddenly, which is completely unexpected, of multiplied by 40. $800,000 overnight, which you didn't know was there, and the bank manager is giving you 7 days to bring the matter into order, to find funds to pay into the account. Or else they'd foreclose on Chartwell. That's quite plain. Churchill is frantic. This is February 1938. He writes a letter to his crony, Brendan Bracken, who later became Lord Bracken, and said, "Can you ask your friends in the city what they can do to help me in this awful situation? If they can't help me now, then I'm faced with the choice only of getting out of politics, going into the city, taking on directorships, and of devoting myself to city directorships and my writing career, because if I finish my great work, the history of the English-speaking peoples, then I can find enough money to pay off this appalling debt. See what you can do in the city, however." He puts his house Chartwell on the market. If you look in the newspaper libraries and you see in the Times of the 2nd of April 1938, you'll see that Churchill's private house is up for sale, £25,000. That would have paid off the debt and left him a little bit to spare. So that's the evidence of all this, as well as the letter that I just quoted. The Austrian crisis comes to its height. The Chancellor, Schuschnigg, goes to see Hitler. An ultimatum agreement is signed under duress. Schuschnigg goes back to Vienna. Schuschnigg proclaims a plebiscite. Churchill should be fighting mad. He should be making great speeches. But he's not. He's muted by his own financial impotence. And out of the city woodwork, which I mentioned before, crawls an Austrian multimillionaire with the name of Sir Henry Strakosch. Brendan Bracken has found him there, lurking in the woodwork like a weevil. And out comes Strakosch and announces in a letter through Brendan Bracken that "I will buy up all your debts." Strakosch agreed to buy all Winston Churchill's debts to the firm Vickers da Costa, paid him £20,000, which left a few £100s to spare. Bought up all the debts. The letter of agreement actually read that Strakosch would buy off all Churchill's debts. He would run the account. If the shares account in future made a profit, then the profit would go to Churchill. If it made a loss, then Strakosch would very kindly cut that loss off with a knife and pay it himself. A very nice situation for Mr. Churchill. Above all, it removed this overnight nightmare for him. Strakosch was an Austrian. He had fled to England in 1906. He'd come to England as an emigrant. He had then gone to South Africa, where he had become a multimillionaire in the gold mines. He returned to England as a financier and used his finance in the City of London to become even richer. Sir Henry Strakosch. All this is true, there's no doubt about it, because if you go back to the files of the Times again, on the 1st of February 1944, you'll see that Strakosch has died a few weeks earlier. And under English law, his testament has been published in the Times, and he has left exactly £20,000 to the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, to wipe out the debt, because otherwise the estate would not recognise the agreement and would go to Mr. Churchill and ask for the repayment of what had been ostensibly a loan. So exactly that sum is left to Mr. Churchill under the Strakosch debt. Not only to Churchill, Strakosch has also left £10,000 to the Lord Chancellor, Sir John Simon, and £10,000 to another British cabinet minister, who was therefore clearly in his pay, in his bribe, in his employ, just as Mr. Churchill was. Churchill's immediate insolvency is settled by this £20,000 payment, but his financial misery continues. He's still not getting enough money to pay for the cost of Chartwell and all his extravagant living, his governesses, his secretaries, his ghostwriters, and all the rest of them. So the problem arises, where does he get money from now? Well, I've got the answer, because I've done a lot of work in the files of the Czech government. The Czech government started paying not only Mr. Churchill, but also every member of his political group, the Focus. Colossal sum of money. We've heard before about £500, about £2,000, about £20,000. The Czech government sent a payment July 1938, because obviously Czechoslovakia is next on Hitler's menu. The Czech government sent a payment in July 1938 to the ambassador in London, the Czech ambassador Jan Masaryk, for £2 million. Two separate payments. Not exactly £2 million, of course, it was the equivalent number of Czech crowns. All these payments are recorded in the Czech files, and I've actually seen the checkbook stubs. They were paid into a special account that Jan Masaryk set up in the Midland Bank in London, not even the proper embassy account. And after Czechoslovakia vanished, at the time of the Munich Agreement in March 1939, in September, and the subsequent entry into Prague in March 1939, after those events, when the subsequent Czech government sent investigators to London to find out where the money had gone, Jan Masaryk refused to answer. He said he'd used the money in the interests of Czechoslovakia, and he didn't consider himself bound to answer to the new government as to whom he had paid the money to. But we know who he paid the money to from several sources. Firstly, the principal Czech intelligence agent in London was a Catholic priest. And he wrote a report in October 1938 after the Munich Agreement, which really wrote finis to Czechoslovakia. And this report is in the Czech files. And this principal Czech agent says it wasn't until the £2 million came in the summer of 1938, in July 1938, and were made available by our ambassador in London, that I was able to begin active subversive work among the opposition members of Parliament, the Conservative opposition MPs, the Labour and the Liberal members of Parliament, who were all agreeing to overthrow Neville Chamberlain if they could. That made my work much easier, the funds made available through Jan Masaryk. Jan Masaryk himself frequently telephoned to Dr. Beneš, the Czech president in Prague. London, Prague. The telephone line ran across German territory. The Germans listened in their rather ungentlemanlike way. We know how ungentlemanlike the Germans can be when they try. They had ways of finding things out. And they listened into this telephone call between Beneš and Masaryk repeatedly. And the Germans, their Forschungsamt, as it was called, the research office, Hermann Göring's wiretap agency, they wrote the transcripts of these Czech conversations on brown pages of paper, the famous Braune Blätter, or Brauner Vögel as they were called in the German intelligence parlance. And on 23rd of September 1938, 7 days before the Munich Agreement, Hitler was tactless. He gave the entire folder of the transcripts to the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, and said, "You'd better show your boss what is going on behind his back." Churchill, according to Jan Masaryk, Mr. Churchill is asking for more. Mr. Attlee is asking for more, but they guarantee that they will bring down Neville Chamberlain and his government before any harm comes to Czechoslovakia. Churchill asking for more. The transcripts were handed by Neville Chamberlain, by Henderson in Berlin, immediately by courier to the Foreign Office in London. You can see them in the British archives now. That's where you find these brown pages. The British can't read them because they're in German. They don't understand the meaning of brown paper anymore. The fact that they don't understand what the initials FA stand for. FA is Forschungsamt, which was Göring's wiretap agency. What is quite plain, though, is that they were horrified by these references to Churchill's machinations because they put 3 lines in the margin with pencil and a row of exclamation marks. This is what Winston is up to. And Chamberlain writes to his sister, saying, "I have proof now from the most extraordinary source of what Churchill is getting up to behind my back." Not only Churchill. Members of his group, the Focus, were also taking huge payments from the Czechs. And this isn't the lunatic fringe writer David Irving, who deserves only to be arrested, who's saying this. I mentioned before the danger of having wives who write diaries. Edward Spears, Conservative member of Parliament for Carlisle, one of the leading members of the Focus. He had been in the First World War with Churchill. Between the wars, as I say, he was one of his principal political allies. In the Second World War, Churchill made him his liaison officer General de Gaulle, no less. Edward Spears was one who was on the payroll of the Czechs. He had married a famous American novelist, Mary Borden. I think this Mary Borden was in some way related to your Canadian Borden, the famous, I think it's Robert Borden. And Mary Borden, or Lady Spears as she became upon her marriage, her private diaries are now in the University of Boston, Massachusetts. Let me quote from her private diary of October the 3rd, 1938, 3 days after the Munich Agreement, which finally sets seal upon Czechoslovakia, the agreement signed by Chamberlain, Roosevelt, Daladier and Hitler. "No hope of a seat in the Commons," writes this wife of General Edward Spears. "Go to the cinema with Helene. Hitler is hissed during the newsreel. Duff Cooper's statement good, but not in my opinion inspired. There's talk of a general election. Kingsley Wood is trying to work it. If there is a general election, my husband will lose his seat probably. Faced with the prospect of losing £2,000 a year from the Czechs and his seat in Parliament." Oh dear. Faced with the prospect of losing £2,000 a year and his seat in Parliament. What a tragedy. How shameful it is for me now as an Englishman to come along, born in that very year, 1938, when our empire was at its zenith. In fact, it grew even larger over the next 7 years with the territories that are mandated to us as a result of the hostilities. And then to see it all go pop, like that soap bubble I mentioned earlier, because of the feckless follies of one corrupt politician into whose hands it had been vested in May 1940. A drunken poltroon, as Hitler called him. And I think that he used the word drunk with great temerity and absolute veracity. When I was in Durban, 3 or 4 weeks ago now, seems like a lifetime ago on this world tour, I mentioned Churchill's drunkenness in office and the fact that during large sections of his political career, he was responsible for many drunken excesses. Board of Admiralty meetings, cabinet meetings, war cabinet meetings, defense committee meetings were conducted by Churchill in a state of complete intoxication. This was recorded in the private diaries of those who were present, but never published. Churchill was alive at the time those diaries were published, if they were published at all. And so the wording was always changed. This journalist in Durban, after I'd mentioned that fact, which I just mentioned now, she wrote to me, she telephoned me, and she said, Mr. Irving, you said in your speech that Roosevelt had routinely described Churchill as that drunken bum. Not very nice. I said, what do you mean, not very nice? She said, well, the word routinely is not very nice. And I say, well, on May the 10th, 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister, as we know, we also know now from the private diary of the Secretary of State for the Interior in Washington that at that moment Roosevelt looked up across his cabinet table and said to the assembled American cabinet, getting the news, well, it's a pity. Churchill is, I suppose, the only man that the British have. It's a pity that he's a drunken bum. It's in the diary. And this South African journalist, this female journalist, and by God you have to admire the tenacity of some women, she says to me, Mr. Irving, you used the word routinely. One quote doesn't justify the word routinely, surely. And I say, you want more? Right. April the 20th, 1940, a couple of weeks earlier, Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, visits Roosevelt in Warm Springs in Georgia. And he writes in his diary afterwards, that famous Mackenzie King diary, which you can go and see to your great enjoyment and entertainment now in the public archives in Ottawa. Mackenzie King writes, Roosevelt said, what a pity it is that the only other statesman that the British have of any kind of format and size at all is Winston Churchill. And he's a drunken bum. Right. So this Durban, South African liberal journalist says, Mr. Irving, all right, you've got two sources. Does this justify the use of the word routinely? That Roosevelt routinely called him a drunken bum. So I say, well, how about this? March the 12th, 1940. You see, I've got a head that's just full of dates, completely full of dates. If I unscrew one ear and like that, all dates tumble out all over the floor. My head is full of dates. I'll never put them back again in the right order again, so I won't do it, but believe me, it would happen. March the 12th, 1940, you see, Roosevelt has sent his Assistant Under-Secretary of State, the second man, the most important man in the State Department, on a tour of Europe, a final peacemaking effort, a fact-finding tour, I suppose they call it now, and Sumner Welles has visited London. He's seen Churchill on March the 12th, 1940, in the boardroom at the Admiralty. And he writes in his report to Roosevelt that when I arrived at 5 p.m. this evening, when I arrived, I found Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty that was then, blind drunk, sitting behind his desk with a 3/4 empty bottle of whiskey on the little table next to his desk, completely incoherent. And at the end of this long report, Sumner Welles writes the words, by this time an hour and a half had passed, and he had become relatively sober again, and I was able to understand what he was saying. Now you see, the problem is that if you were historians, there would be several among you who would put up your hands and say, but Mr. Irving, this is proof that you are falsifying history. You are inventing quotations just as that Berlin publisher accused you. Remember I mentioned Ullstein and the Canaris diary. Because we know, the historians will say, we know that in Sumner Welles' report of March the 12th, 1940, which is available freely to all, there's no reference to Churchill being drunk, or to a whiskey bottle, or to getting sober again. So you've invented it. To which I will reply, this is because you historians can never be bothered to go into the original archives and dig out the documents. You always prefer to use the printed volumes which are published by the official governments, the printed volumes, because they've got nice indexes, of course, and page numbers, and sometimes they've even got pretty pictures to keep you awake in between the pages. And if you go to the printed records of the Foreign Relations of the United States, the official government publication of these diplomatic files, you'll find, as he says, no reference to the drunkenness. But you will see ... at the beginning and ... near the end of the report, where those sentences have been cut out by the government censors in Washington, because it's considered indelicate to say that Mr. Churchill was drunk. And so it goes on. You see again and again that the documents are being faked. They're being faked for our own edification and for the purification of history. Mr. Churchill is represented whiter and white. I'll come back to his drunkenness towards the end of my talk, because it isn't just for hilarity that I mention it. He made disastrous mistakes at the time. At the same time as the record of Winston Churchill is being whitened, so of course the record of Adolf Hitler, well, it can hardly be blackened, because it was black from the moment it began, and the moment we began to pay attention to it during the Second World War. We had to believe that the record of Hitler was black, because otherwise we couldn't justify having wrecked our own empire in order to fight that war through to a finish. We had to paint him as being the devil incarnate. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was Bergen-Belsen, there was Dachau, there was Buchenwald, and subsequently, of course, the great big Holocaust legend has been built up into its almost impregnable form now, where the whole world now believes that one man, Adolf Hitler, mad, of course, one madman, Adolf Hitler, killed 6 million people in Auschwitz, etc. On this great big romantic notion, which is kept alive for various reasons of international finance and high politics and statesmanship, it's been kept alive because nobody dares attack it. In Germany, it is now a criminal offense to attack the last few words of that. You're not allowed to question the 6 million or the notion that they were killed. And the notion that Adolf Hitler was responsible for it is absolutely invulnerable. You mustn't even begin to question it. So when in my biography I came to the conclusion, having spent 8 or 10 years writing the life of Adolf Hitler, I came to the astonishing, in fact, bewildering fact that I'd not come across any evidence that Hitler even knew it was going on, whatever was going on. All the other crimes are there: the killing of the Russian commissars, the killing of British commandos, the lynching of Allied airmen, the orders to wipe out to kill off the mentally insane, the euthanasia order, which has Hitler's own signature on the document. Those are in the files all the way through, from the top right down to the bottom, from Hitler's headquarters right down the street level. You've got the documents, but not this one. Now, the historians, of course, have solved this problem quite simply by not mentioning the gap. I remember when I told my literary agent Max Becker in New York that I'd come across an awful gap in the evidence, which I was going to have to explain openly and honestly by saying that you have to explain the gap by saying that by postulating that perhaps Hitler didn't even know anything was going on because no documents crossed his desk showing that he did know what was going on. My agent Max Becker said, "For God's sake, David, if you do that, you're bankrupted," and of course I am too, because he's Mr. 10%. He gets 10% of what I do get or what I don't get. And he said, "Invent evidence. If you can't find the evidence, just invent evidence. Plug that gap somehow, rather like the Dutch boy plugging the gap in the dike. God knows what would happen if that gap was left there. Invent evidence. Just stuff any old kind of newspaper articles in. Anything to plug the gap and make it look as though Hitler knew. Because otherwise you're going to lose the Sunday Times." We've got a big deal lined up for the Sunday Times in England, who were going to serialize the book. You're going to lose the Reader's Digest, you're going to lose the Book of the Month Club, you're going to lose the Military Book of the Month Club, and you're going to lose any hope of doing a paperback deal in Madison Avenue. They're not going to publish the book if you don't plug that gap somehow, because your thesis is completely unacceptable. And I explained to him that I couldn't do that. In fact, we did. We lost all those deals. Anybody who says, and as occasionally they do, Irving, just by saying that about Hitler, by raising that absurd hypothesis, of course, you made the book very well known, and you must have made a mint out of it, must have made a bomb out of saying that, shows that he doesn't know the first thing about the publishing economics. You don't make money out of the hardback book. You make money out of all those deals I mentioned, the subsidiary deals. And by deliberately turning my back on them, I must have lost probably $200,000 or $300,000 at a minimum, probably far more. And Max Becker just then had to groan and say, well, if you're determined to commit suicide like this, then go ahead and do it. And I must admit I was nervous, because I thought that perhaps somewhere in the files there might be evidence that I was wrong. I couldn't find it. I'd spent a lot of effort trying to find it. But I've been heartened in my approach by the knowledge that the documents that I had found about Hitler and the Jewish question, remarkably enough, all the genuine documents about that showed him extending his hand to protect them. So anything that had been done to them had been done by people far lower down the scale, ordinary common criminals, like you have in any national army or in any great police force. There's always the psychopath who will do things, for whom really the head of state can't be personally held responsible, even if he is constitutionally responsible. But of course that's a different shooting match altogether, and very different from this romantic notion which I mentioned earlier about the madman Adolf Hitler personally ordering and giving and having knowledge of the killing of 6 million Jews. That's very different if you accept my notion that the whole tragedy on whatever scale occurred just as a result of these wretched people falling into the hands of a large number of psychopaths wherever they were. And this is one reason why I'm coming under increasingly vehement attack on this world tour. I've had to see one university after another closing its doors to me. In Sydney, in Perth, in Western Australia, in Auckland. Universities came under pressure from certain groups. I saw the leaflets that were sent out, very well financed by that body I mentioned before, in New York. They were sent out to New Zealand and to Australia and to South Africa to try and persuade the media not to give me a platform. And only in 20% of the cases did it really work. 20% of the universities then withdrew the permission for me to speak on the campus. And as I said, it's rather like the war in England, when we thought that by shooting down 20% of the flying bombs that were reaching London, we were doing a wonderful thing and that we'd bring the campaign to a halt. The trouble was 80% of those flying bombs got through. And so it is with me. Even if 20% of David Irving gets shot down, 80% of David Irving gets through, and the damage is done to the enemy target. We have to explain, you see, that the documents which do exist in the file, the genuine documents, show Hitler trying to protect the Jews. The Night of Broken Glass, that famous event in November 1938 when thousands of Jewish shops were smashed and burned down and looted and plundered. 60 or 70 Jews were murdered by individual gangsters that night. 100 or 200 synagogues were burnt down. We have to explain how it is that when Hitler gets the word of that at 2 o'clock in the morning, I know because I've spoken to all the people who were with him at that precise moment, I know how he got the news, he pulls out every organ stop to try and stop this madness. He calls in his ministers, Himmler, chief of the SS, Goebbels, the chief of the propaganda. He calls them in, and all their officials. He has messages sent out all night by telex and teleprinter to stop the madness. In particular, one document in the files of the German, in the files of the second man under Hitler, Rudolf Hess, issued that very night, 10th of November 1938. It's only 3 lines long. In fact, those of you who bought a copy of my book today, The Warpath, you'll find that I print that as a facsimile. 3 lines on Hess's headed notepaper saying, on explicit orders from the very highest level, which must be Hitler, there are to be absolutely no acts of arson or outrages whatsoever against Jewish property or the Jewish community. This means Hitler's intervening. That's repeating, explicitly the document says, repeating the teleprints that we sent out this evening, frantically trying to stop what's already started. The next document, November 1941, Himmler's come to him with a proposal to liquidate Jews being sent out from Berlin. I've got Himmler's own telephone notes, what he wrote down, paid day after day, all his telephone conversations. I'm the only person who bothered to read them because they're in handwriting. And I mentioned before how lazy the historians are. They only read the printed volumes. And here are Himmler's handwritten notes on every telephone conversation he made during the war. Trainload of Jews, he writes, November the 30th, 1941. Trainload of Jews from Berlin, not to be liquidated. He's making the telephone call from Hitler's bunker to the chief of the Gestapo, Heydrich. Obviously, Hitler has intervened once again to say, are you out of your mind? What are you planning? What are you plotting? Don't do it. A few weeks later, April the 20th, 1942, exactly the same. Himmler in Hitler's bunker, telephoning Heydrich in Prague, the chief of the Gestapo, saying, gypsies, not to be liquidated. Keine Vernichtung der Zigeuner. Again in Himmler's own handwriting, a document of the highest authenticity. You won't find these documents quoted anywhere in the entire body of historians who are against me. Raoul Hilberg, all the other historians who've written about the Holocaust, you won't find these documents quoted. There's another one. I've got a facsimile I can show you later on if you're interested in my brochure, which I've been using on this worldwide tour. It's from the files of the Ministry of Justice. The spring of 1942, about April 1942, the chief civil servant has written to Hitler. I'm sorry, let's say that again. The chief civil servant, Dr. Hans Lammers, rather like a prime minister, directly between Hitler and the civil service, has written to the chief of the the Ministry of Justice, the deputy minister of justice, a man called Schlegelberger. And in this document he says, according to Schlegelberger's own typescript note, that Lammers has telephoned to say that the Führer has repeatedly ordained that the solution of the Jewish problem is to be postponed until after the war is over. You see, you're all silent because the very notion that there are documents saying this kind of thing, but there's no document saying the other thing, of course, that Hitler wants it done, or that he knows is going on. That there are documents where Hitler is actually intervening to say he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. It's actually in the files of the Ministry of Justice. Now, this document vanished after the war. It wasn't available at Nuremberg. It vanished from the Nuremberg doc files, and it mysteriously reappeared around about 1950, when it was no longer of any use in the great war crimes trials after the war. It's in the archives again now in the files of the German Ministry of Justice. You won't find that document referred to anywhere by the historians either, the historians of the Holocaust. They act as though these documents don't even exist. They're authentic, there's no question. They can't challenge the authenticity. But they act rather like a card sharp, like somebody who cheats at cards, who drops the incriminating ace of spades or whatever it is on the floor. And then he puts his flat foot on it. And then with that foot he shuffles it under the table and hopes nobody's seen him doing it. And he'll pick it up later. And so it is with the historians. These documents, they can't fit into the acceptable hypothesis. They pretend that these documents don't exist. Which, of course, is not the scientific way of doing things at all. A scientist has to set up a hypothesis and make his hypothesis fit the documents, fit the facts, and not make the documentary archives fit into his prearranged, preconceived notion. That's all the wrong way of doing it. They take these documents, the archives, and they cut off the head and the feet and the arms because they can't make it fit into their bed otherwise. And that way, of course, they don't really deserve the title of historian. I've said to the German bodies of students that I've spoken to 1,000 students in Bonn only 2 or 3 years back, and I told them about this document on the explicit orders on the very highest level and so on. And they were absolutely silent. They hadn't heard it either. And I say the reason why you're silent is it's taken me as an Englishman to come 40 years after the event and tell you about documents that your own professors sitting here in the front row, they all were, all the rector and the dean and the professors of history, they haven't told you about. And the only explanation why they haven't told you about these documents is either they didn't know the document existed, they were ignorant of this document, in which case they're really incompetent and not fit to be your professors, or more likely they did know about this document, but they've decided to suppress it because they can't make it fit in with the accepted theories, in which case they shouldn't be your professors either. And that is the situation today. And it isn't good enough for the historians of the world to go around shouting and screaming blue murder at me. I offer £1,000, and I repeat the challenge here today. Any historian, any private person who can find one wartime document showing that Hitler knew about Auschwitz or Treblinka or any part of the Jewish tragedy that's now propagated again and again and again by our opponents, I will give £1,000 for one wartime document showing that. It should be there. It should be easy. After all, they've been saying it for 40 or 50 years now. They should have the documents on hand. How can you stake a claim like that without having the documents already available? And AJP, thank you. AJP Taylor, AJP Taylor, the British historian, of course, I remember coming up against him in a television program in England a year ago, and he says, Mr. Irving, how undignified for you as a historian to offer £1,000. I occasionally go round with it in my pocket, and I bring it out of my pocket and wag it. I don't do it today, not with all the brethren from Detroit running around, because I might be relieved of the money in a most unhistorical way. But occasionally I do that, and he says, how undignified to do that. Historians don't operate like that. And I said, what you mean is how embarrassing for us historians that you do that and we can't prove you wrong. And that is how it is. The historians are faked and faked and faked. They faked to blacken the name of Hitler to justify our war against him, and they faked to purify the name of Winston Churchill, who fought this drunken war against Germany and against Europe for no other purpose than the glorification of his own name. Now let me justify that, because it's a very, very severe charge to level at this great Englishman. Churchill came to office in May 1940. In June 1940, when France had also been knocked out by a brilliant military campaign that Hitler himself had masterminded, in June 1940, Hitler repeated his peace offer to the British. You remember the peace offer? I want nothing from Britain, nothing from the British Empire. I'm prepared even to give German forces to help defend the British Empire against the Italians, the Japanese, the Russians, or any other aggressors. This was the extraordinary, magnanimous, secret German offer to the British. Churchill received this offer by various channels during June 1940, and on various occasions was on the point of accepting it. We know this because in his cabinet were members of his war cabinet, Lord Halifax, Lord Beaverbrook, the great Canadian, the Minister of Aircraft Production, Neville Chamberlain, who was the former Prime Minister, 3 members of his 6-man cabinet. Half the cabinet wanted peace on those terms. And Chamberlain and Lord Halifax actually wrote descriptions of these cabinet meetings in their private diaries. And they described Churchill as being inclined to accept the German terms. The word terms is too harsh, because terms implies there was something disadvantageous to us. The German offer. He was inclined to accept the German offer, provided that Britain, the Empire's sovereignty, integrity, and independence were safeguarded as they appeared to be. But you can imagine Churchill slapping himself on his wrist the same day, that night, when he's left the cabinet, saying, what am I saying? Am I mad? If I accept these terms, I am finished. Because on his personal record, ever since the beginning of his miserable life, there had only been one military fiasco after another. Gallipoli, 1921, between the wars, he had tried to declare war on Turkey. World War II would have begun then. It was a drunken cabinet meeting attended by F.E. Smith and Mr. Churchill. They both had a very heavy dinner, a lot of drinking, and you'll find the references to that in the private diaries of Mackenzie King again, a Privy Councillor to whom all this was related under the seal of secrecy as a Privy Councillor. 1940, we have Dunkirk, one of our most shameful episodes in British history, when Churchill personally gives orders to the British general in charge, Lord Gort, to withdraw, to retreat, to pull out of the line, without informing either of his brother generals to the right or the left, the Belgians or the French. Explicitly ordered not to tell his allies that he was pulling out, or as Churchill said, advancing to the coast. This was the way that Churchill put it in the order to Lord Gort. You were to advance to the coast without notifying either the French or the British High Command, the French or the Belgian High Command. A most shameful order. If you look in the British archives now, and you're writing a book about Dunkirk perhaps, you'll be given the premier files, the Prem 3 files on Winston Churchill and Dunkirk. which are, you'll be given the photocopies of those files. You won't be given the original folders. And you'll notice that there are blank pages all the way through those folders, interspersed. And you think, how kind of the people to have bound them with blank pages to keep the documents apart. The blank pages are documents that have been withdrawn because they're too sensitive for us to be seen even now, 46 years after the event. Hui, the 30-year rule that we're allowed to see everything after 30 years. Those documents withdraw. I went to the French Prime Minister's widow, the widow of Monsieur Paul Reynaud, who was the French Prime Minister in 1940, and persuaded her with trembling hand and fragile eyesight to write out an agreement for me to be allowed to see all her husband's papers in the French archives. And there are the letters that Mr. Churchill had removed from the British files, so we can see the truth about Dunkirk. And it's one of the most shameful episodes in British history. The fact that we sank the French fleet in July 1940 because of a French translation error, a faulty translation of the word control. Churchill translated the word as control, which is reasonable enough, but controller in German, control in French, in the wording of the Armistice Commission, the Armistice of June the 23rd, 1940, does not mean control. It means supervision, something completely different. Because of this false translation, Churchill orders the sinking of the fleet and the killing of 12,000 French officers and seamen. Another of the great scandals of the Second World War. You won't find it in the files because the British files are also closed. But most significant is to see that these cabinet meetings of June and July 1940, where Churchill is on the point of accepting Hitler's offer, has been blanked out. You can see it in the private diaries of Chamberlain and Halifax, who were present, but the paragraphs in the cabinet protocols have been blanked out in the photocopy that you're given to read, so you can't read the paragraphs relating to the Hitler peace offer and the fact that Mr. Churchill was on the point of accepting it. Because, of course, how embarrassing to admit. I mean, it's like my own case. This huge libel action I lost in 1970 eventually cost me and my publishers Cassels in London £250,000 because we thought we were right. We fought it right through to the House of Lords twice. It lasted 4 years. £250,000 was a huge sum of money in those days. Big sum of money now, I suppose, over $1 million Canadian dollars. But we fought it through, we considered that we were right. How absurd and embarrassing to have to admit, as we must now, that back at the beginning we could probably have settled out £250,000. Right back at the beginning, but we thought we were right, so we fought right through to the end. And poor old Cassels, this great English publishing house, went bankrupt over that case. They're no longer in business. It's exactly the same as what happened with the Empire. Churchill could have settled out of court in June and July 1940 on honourable terms, which would have preserved Britain and the British Empire, which I've always considered to be one of the great civilizing, culturing influences in the history of the world. We would now have been the predominant force on the world. The British, not the Soviets, not the Americans. We would have been there. We could have been dictating the terms of peace and civilization today instead of those newcomers, the Americans, or those barbarians, the Russians. But Mr. Churchill frittered that all away because he knew that if he did so, if he accepted the peace terms in June and July 1940, he, Winston Churchill, would be out. He would be into oblivion, down the tubes of history. There would be no bronze monument to Mr. Churchill in Parliament Square in London, and he couldn't afford it. So he cast around for ways of killing off the peace movement which was beginning to gather momentum in Britain, not only in his own cabinet, 50-50 as I mentioned, half the cabinet wanted peace. More than half the British people wanted peace. Because, incredible though it now seems when we look back, at that time in the summer of 1940 not one German bomb had yet fallen on a British town. Mr. Churchill knew why, because we were reading the British codes, the famous ultra-secret that is now common knowledge. At that time we had begun reading the German Air Force Code in May 1940, we were reading the German Navy codes, and above all we were reading the German embassy codes. So we were reading what Hitler's orders were, more often than not. And Churchill knew by the summer of 1940 that that man in Berlin had given wicked, wicked, wicked orders that no British town was ever to be bombed. The British were to be allowed to begin the bombing war. And above all, an absolute embargo on the bombing of London. Churchill must really have wrung his hands in despair. How could he hope to bring the British people behind him for a prosecution of the war under those terms? He had told Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, the famous father of the later president, Joseph P. Kennedy, whose diary I've partly read, the parts that matter, and whose telegrams to Washington I've also dug out of the archives in Maryland and read as well. He had told Ambassador Kennedy that he actually wanted Hitler to start bombing London because this would bring an end to the awful peace movement that was causing him such problems in England, and above all, when the Americans saw the barbarity and frightfulness of the Nazi air raids on England begin, and towns like Lincoln and Boston beginning to suffer, then surely that must bring the Americans into the war on the British side. What cynicism and hypocrisy to actually want the bombing of your own capital city to begin. Not that Mr. Churchill would have minded, of course. He alone had an air raid shelter with 17 feet of concrete in the roof. The famous Cabinet War Rooms that you can go and visit now when you go as a tourist to London, you'll see the Cabinet War Rooms. The Buckingham Palace didn't have a shelter. The King and Queen didn't have a shelter. Harry Hopkins goes to London a few months later in January 1941, and he finds the King and Queen taking shelter in a cupboard under the stairs in Buckingham Palace. When Mr. Churchill had 17 feet of concrete in the roof, he didn't feel safe there. He used to go, in fact, to an underground tube station on the Piccadilly line, the old Down Street station, and he would be there 400 feet underground, and he would take refuge there. That underground station has remained permanently closed now because of the reconstruction work that was done for Mr. Churchill in 1940. He didn't care. But until the summer of 1940, not one bomb had dropped on an English town. He had to provoke it somehow. Now, I ask you to consider one date in English history. It's not a famous date like the Battle of Britain Day, September the 15th, or the 1st of September when war broke out. Look at July the 20th, 1940. This is one of the most significant dates. On that day, Churchill is lying in bed, as his wont, in Chequers, his country house, the Prime Minister's residence, out in the country, Sunday morning, and he gets the intercept, the decode, the decrypt, of a German embassy telegram from Washington to Berlin. The German ambassador in Washington, one Hans Thompson, reports, the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, has secretly put out feelers to me to ask what our peace offer is. Through an intermediary, through a Quaker intermediary called Loveman or Loveday or Lovejoy or something. Lord Lothian wants to find out the peace offer, and this is the one thing that Churchill can't possibly afford, that the British find out what the Hitler peace offer is. That will be the end of Churchill, of course. He sends an immediate telegram to Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, saying, put the stop on your ambassador in Washington immediately. He's not allowed to contact the German ambassador. He sends a telegram to Lord Lothian in person, the British ambassador, saying you are not to have any further dealings with the German ambassador, whether directly or indirectly. And on the same day, and this is what makes July the 20th, 1940 so important, Churchill sends for Sir Charles Portal, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, and he says, when is the earliest day that you can launch a savage attack on Berlin? And Sir Charles Portal says, Prime Minister, we can't do it yet because the nights are too short. We can't get our squadrons from London, from England, out to Berlin and back in the hours of darkness. We can do it in September, but not yet. And in September, of course, we will have the new generation of bombers. The Sterling heavy bomber will be there, and we can use them. We'll have 100 of them. But I warn you, if you do that, then the Germans will retaliate. At present, they're not bombing our cities or our towns. Their entire attack is being dedicated to the RAF fighter defences. The airfields, the radar system, the sector stations were being remorselessly knocked out one by the German attack. The Battle of Britain had begun, of course. But it was only being devoted at that time to the dockyards, the blockade, the shipping, and the fighter stations, not to the towns or the cities. And Churchill, when Sir Charles Portal uttered this warning that the enemy might retaliate, Churchill just twinkled. Well, we know why, because he wanted the attack to begin, but he was reading the German signals which said that they had no intention of attacking London. So we can understand why 2 weeks later, when General Charles de Gaulle visits him, out at Chequers, again a Sunday, he finds him on August the 4th, 1940, Mr. Churchill standing in the middle of his lawn, shaking his little fist at the sky, his little pink fist, and saying, why won't you come? You read de Gaulle's memoirs and you'll see this. De Gaulle doesn't understand what this little scene was all about, but we now know. Churchill was wondering why the Germans were not going to start bombing, why they were refusing to start. He couldn't understand it. And he gets his chance on August the 24th, 1940, when one German plane flying in from the west along the Thames flies one loop too far along the Thames and drops its bombs not on Rotherhithe, where the oil refinery is that it was supposed to be bombing, the oil tanks, but on the east end of London. A stick of bombs falls on the east end of London, just inside the boundaries of Greater London, and it kills a large number of chicken and blows in several windows and flattens a couple of these old Dickensian tenement buildings, and Churchill has his pretext. He gets the news that Saturday night, Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, August the 25th, 1940, at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning, Churchill personally telephones the headquarters of Bomber Command at High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. And he speaks with the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Air Vice Marshal Sir Norman Bottomley, and says, I want a minimum of 100 bombers to attack Berlin tonight in retaliation for this savage series of raids on London. This is Mr. Churchill. And, I mean, you don't need to have access to the Churchill files to know this, because it's in the files of Bomber Command. In the records of Bomber Command, which have now, of course, been placed in the public archives in England, you can see the actual transcript of Churchill's telephone conversation between Churchill himself out in the country and Air Vice Marshal Sir Norman Bottomley in Bomber Command headquarters. You note the chain of command. A direct telephone link from Churchill to the Bomber Command headquarters, bypassing the cabinet, bypassing Parliament, bypassing the Air Ministry and the Secretary of State for Air, this wet liberal Sir Archibald Sinclair, a telephone call direct to Bomber Command headquarters, although it's going to have immense political consequences. And that night 100 bombers go out to Berlin and 30 get through and do quite a lot of damage in the west end of Berlin, killing several people. And over the next 10 days, RAF Bomber Command repeats this raid 6 or 7 times. Sometimes missing completely, sometimes getting through and doing considerable damage and causing civilian casualties. Still, Hitler refuses to respond. This is the interesting thing. Hitler, in his madness, still thinks that he can persuade the British to accept his offer. On that final day, September the 4th, 1940, after there have been 7 raids, Hitler sends for a lawyer called Dr. Ludwig Weishaar and sends the lawyer to the Stockholm embassy of the British to speak to the British ambassador and tell the British ambassador there what the peace offer is. But the ambassador, Victor Mallet, tells this lawyer, Weishaar, I'm sorry, my orders are I'm not allowed to accept any German emissary on the embassy premises, and I'm not allowed to listen to anything about German offers, Mr. Churchill's personal orders. Hitler sends for Rudolf Hess that same day, September the 4th, and says to Rudolf Hess, you've told me so frequently about your contacts in England and Scotland. Please will you do your utmost now to establish contact personally with these people and tell them what our offer is. We don't seem to be getting through to the British public. And this, of course, is the famous beginning of the Rudolf Hess peace mission, his tragic flight in May 1941, his first ever parachute jump in his life. In the middle of the velvety hours of blackness, he makes his first ever parachute jump and lands only 12 miles away from the man he's gone to see, the Duke of Hamilton. And on the same day, that same September the 4th, 1940, Hitler makes a speech in the Sport Palace in Berlin in which he says, if that poltroon, that drunken poltroon in England, once more attacks us, if he sends aircraft with 10 kilograms of bombs, we will send 1,000 kilograms. If he sends 100 planes, we will send 1,000 bombers to attack their cities. If he attacks our cities anymore, then I will eradicate theirs. Ich werde ihre Städte ausradieren. This famous, one of Hitler's most famous speeches. And Churchill's ears prick up. This, of course, means he's getting exactly what he wants. He sends an order to Bomber Command, you are to launch another violent air raid on Berlin at the earliest opportunity, that same afternoon. And on the following day, September the 5th, the bombers return to Berlin, whereupon Hitler lifts the embargo. I've got the diaries of the Deputy Chief of Operations on the German Air Force, the diary of the Chief of the number 2 under Goering and so on. We know the exact sequence of events. There can be no doubt whatsoever as to the sequence. And on the afternoon of September the 6th, 1940, the east end of London reverberates to the approach of enemy bombers for the first time on a colossal scale. 1,000 bombers come up the Thames, far past the military oil refineries, the oil tanks along the Thames, the dockyards. They come right into the East End and bomb the dockyards, the East End, the factory, the workers' homes. They set street upon street, entire suburbs in flames. The whole of the East End of London is covered in fire and smoke that afternoon, that Saturday afternoon. We in the West End pour out into the streets and into the parks and into the open spaces, the embankment of the river, to see this extraordinary spectacle. The whole of the East End of our capital on fire. We've never seen anything. This vivid picture, this proof of Nazi frightfulness is there for us now to see. We can hear what the people are saying behind us, this wicked man in Germany who's done this to us. And during the night the planes come back and they repeat the damage, because of course they've got the fires as a beacon to guide them on their way. And between the hours of dusk and dawn, 1,000 Londoners were killed in this air raid, between the 6th and the 7th of September 1940. The first great opening raid of the Blitz on London. Mr. Churchill has his way. He's been out in the country, of course, because he knew from code breaking the raid was coming. He comes back the following day in his big black Humber limousine, puts on an Air Commodore's uniform. I don't know why. He wears an RAF Air Commodore's uniform to tour the East End of London to see the damaged areas. Climbs out of his car, he finds entire streets have been levelled, pathetic heaps of rubble, with English Union flags sticking out on top that had been issued the hour before by Ministry of Information officials. That's part of the propaganda story, of course. You need the pathetic people, the Union flag bravely fluttering, Mr. Churchill walking around with his Air Commodore's uniform, the old women who've lost everything, their family, their household, their radio sets, the budgerigar, everything has gone up in flames. They've saved perhaps just the kitchen stove. But there's Winston Churchill, their Prime Minister, waddling around with his cigar, and they're saying to him, good old Winnie, good old Winnie, we knew you wouldn't desert us. We knew you were here. London can take it. And this became the title of a famous film, London Can Take It. That's the title of one of my chapters of my Churchill biography, London Can Take It. The trouble was that Mr. Churchill could not. He was never once in London when an air raid came. He knew in advance when the air raids were coming from the code breaking. And only once or twice out of accident, when the code breakers failed him, was he caught in the midst of an air raid in London in the depths of his bunker. He no longer went out to Chequers when the air raids came, because Chequers also, the famous residence of the British Prime Minister, was also endangered. He had selected the private country house of a Conservative Member of Parliament, one of his focus group. Of course, he had rewarded the focus group members of Parliament and Labour, Liberal and Conservative opposition people who had backed him up in the wilderness. He'd rewarded them all with cabinet posts and high office. One of them, Ronald Tree, he had a country house out in Oxfordshire called Ditchley. And Churchill drove out there every time the codebreakers told him a raid was due, 150 miles away. There he felt safe. And he would drive back the following morning in order to be seen in the streets of London. This is the true image of Churchill. And if you think I'm being unjust on Churchill, then consider the case of Coventry, the famous legendary air raid on Coventry. When we think of legends, romantic notions like the Holocaust, what about the other legends like Coventry and Hiroshima? Coventry, of course, we all know what it means, the most barbarous air raid on Britain during the war. 300 people were killed there, I believe, altogether, slightly over 300 perhaps. Enormous industrial was damage to the aero engine. But the real story of Coventry is where Mr. Churchill was that day. You see, Churchill was told 2 days before that there was going to be a barbarous air raid on Coventry, a barbarous air raid on Britain. The Air Ministry sent him a message, which is in the Air Ministry files now, and they said, Prime Minister, we have just received intelligence from our code-breaking office that the Germans are going to carry out a vicious air raid in 3 consecutive nights with their entire air force, all 3 Luftflotten, all 3 air fleets, over 1,000 bombers escorted by fighter planes are going to attack a target. We know the second priority is outer London, the third priority is the Thames estuary, the fourth priority is the home counties, so it stands to reason the top priority is the centre of London. They're going to attack it night after night for 3 nights. Code name Moonlight Sonata, Mondscheinse Renate. So it stands to reason that the first night is going to be the first full moon night. And Churchill says, when is this? And the Air Ministry says, well, the first full moon night's the night of November the 14th to the 15th. Well, one of the documents I've managed to obtain, I managed to rent for £5,000 the private desk diaries of Mr. Churchill. I rented them from the gentleman who stole them, who was his bodyguard, his Scotland Yard detective. Tommy Thompson. Commander Tommy Thompson's godson rented them to me. And here is the extract from the desk diary for the actual Coventry period. I mentioned, as I said, Mondscheinse Renate was going to be the first full moon night, November the 14th. I'll give it to you bigger. Here we are. A blow-up of that. As you see, it was November. November the 14th was going to be the first full moon night, and the raid is going to last for 3 days. 3 days, beginning probably on the dusk of November the 14th to 15th. So Mr. Churchill draws a bracket of 3 days with no appointments in London, please. Because he has been told that the target, number 1, is London. And he says, when will we know when this doleful event is going to take place? And the Air Ministry says, the documents are there in the Air Ministry files. The Air Ministry says, well, Prime Minister, we will know for certain when the date of the raid is, because the Germans always send out on the morning of a raid a spotter plane to check the weather over the route. And we intercept his radio signal back to Berlin. So that will give us warning of the actual day of the raid. And we will know of the actual target of the raid when the Germans that afternoon switch on their blind bombing beams. And we will send up a radio plane, a radio intelligence plane, to see where the beams intersect. And that tells us what the actual target is. And Churchill says, very well then, keep me informed. And comes the morning of the raid, November the 14th. He goes about his business as usual. He's got a full programme that morning, November the 14th. He goes to Westminster Abbey at midday for the funeral of poor old Neville Chamberlain, who's died a few days previously of cancer. That's one reason why he wasn't able to continue in office, in fact. And then he comes back from Westminster Abbey. Churchill asks the latest state of play, and the Air Ministry tells him in a message, which is in the files, well, in the meantime, we have now intercepted the radio report of the weather plane. So tonight, Prime Minister, is the night. And on our information, we believe the target is still central London. Churchill looks at his appointment calendar, 2:45 Lord Halifax, 3 o'clock Mr. Attlee, no more appointments after that. He sees these two, I know that, the appointments are confirmed in their private papers. And round about 4 o'clock, when he's finished with Mr. Attlee, he goes trundling out of the back door of number 10, down the garden, to the wall at the end of the number 10 Downing Street, the garden, a big brick wall where there's a gate in it. and his car is parked behind the garden gate, the big black Humber limousine. He never drives off from the front when he's on this escape. He only drives off on the front when the press are there for big state official visits and state business. When he's escaping to his hidey hole in the country, the car's waiting round the back in Horse Guards Parade. I know this because his private secretary who's with him at this moment is a man called John Martin. Still alive, Sir John Martin has been foolish enough to give me complete access to his private diary, which confirms the whole event. Except that Sir John Martin himself doesn't realize what he's shown me, because he only has half the picture. He doesn't have the desk diary, he doesn't have the air ministry signals, which I'm quoting to you. At 4 o'clock, Churchill climbs into his big black Humber limousine to get out before the bombers come. As he's about to drive off, a dispatch rider arrives from the air ministry. Sir John Martin told me this. He said that the envelope was handed in through the window, and as we were driving off, Winston and I passed Hyde Park. We just got past Hyde Park when Winston leans forward and raps on the glass. Driver, back to number 10 Downing Street. The message from the Air Ministry has said, Prime Minister, we have now received word from our radio intelligence plane that they have detected the German blind bombing beams intersecting not over London as we had thought, but over Coventry. So the target for tonight is Coventry, not London after all. Driver, back to number 10. He goes back to number 10 Downing Street, where all his staff are waiting for him, because he hasn't told his secretaries to take the afternoon off. He hasn't said to them, girls, wouldn't you like to go and have 3 days by the seaside or something, or go and visit your aunt up in Newcastle. He's let them all work on in the centre of London. He himself has betaken himself to the countryside. He comes back and they look at him, astonished, round-eyed with astonishment, and they say, Boss, you are back. And he says, this is what Sir John Martin tells me, I have just received the most doleful intelligence from the Air Ministry, and he waves the closed brown envelope in his hand, which he doesn't tell them what's in it, that tonight a most violent and barbarous enemy air raid is expected on London, our fine capital city, on London. And it would not be right for the citizens of this hard-pressed metropolis to gain the impression that I'm not willing to suffer the same trials and tribulations, to go through the same misfortune and sacrifice that I'm asking them to bear. I have therefore decided to come back and share their misfortune with them. And that night at 8 o'clock, according to Sir John Colville in his private diary, another of the secretaries, Churchill goes up onto the roof of number 10 Downing Street, bears his portly waistcoat, and says, I am ready for them to attack now. Let them now start bombing and do their damnedest. I will stand here and take it. Knowing full well that the target for that night is Coventry, 350 miles away. It's a rather sad story about Mr. Churchill, but as President Reagan might say, you ain't heard nothing yet. I mentioned earlier his habit of attending a cabinet in a certain condition. It first comes to our attention, in fact, when we find out that the famous wartime broadcasts of Mr. Churchill, Blood, Sweat and Tears, We Shall Fight on the Beaches, all these famous speeches of Mr. Churchill, which were broadcast in the evening by the BBC, were not broadcast by him at all, because in the evening he was in no condition to broadcast. The actual broadcast voice was that of Norman Shelley, who I became quite a close friend of. Those of us who were in England during the war and heard the broadcasts, we may remember also that at 5 p.m. every evening we'd be listening to Children's Hour. And at 5 p.m. in Children's Hour there was this long-running children's series called Toy Town. And Toy Town, one of the principal characters was Larry the Lamb. Larry the Lamb bleated, bah, like that. And the man who did the bah was Norman Shelley. Norman Shelley was also the best mimic of the Churchill voice, and he was the one the BBC hired to read the Churchill speeches in the evenings because Churchill himself could not. Norman Shelley has confirmed all this to me, and it's confirmed in the archives of the BBC. You see, Churchill, and this was one of the great tragedies of the Second World War, well, he was clinically an alcoholic. There are various clinical definitions for what an alcoholic is. The signs you look for, I mean, we all know what they are, but there are various other things, like a rudeness when you come for a meal and you find that no alcohol is served. This happened during the war, 1943, when Churchill arrived for a state banquet with the Sultan of Morocco, and of course there was no alcohol served at all there, and he was not only rude, he was outrageously rude. President Roosevelt was also present and had been warned, and he was better behaved. And if you read the private diaries of many of those who were present, this rudeness of Churchill on that occasion went down in the memories of many. General Patton, for example, he was present, and he records this in his private diary. The Sultan of Morocco was hideously offended by Churchill's behavior. But Churchill's cabinet members and the people who served with him in the Admiralty, in the Board of Admiralty, all referred to Churchill's drunkenness repeatedly at Admiralty and cabinet meetings, but none of them had the courage to print it in their memoirs. If you read the famous diaries of Lord Allenbrook, for example, General Allenbrook, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, he writes it in his diaries repeatedly about Churchill's drunkenness. The diaries that are published under the title in 2 volumes, The Turn of the Tide and The Triumph in the West, you won't find a word of it, because Churchill was still alive. But if you go to the King's College Library and read the original diaries in leather volumes, which are held together by brass straps with locks on them, you need a key to open these diaries, there you can see it. Or the private diaries of Captain Ralph Edwards, for example, who was the Director of Operations in the Admiralty under Churchill as First Lord at the time of the Norwegian operation. We haven't got time to read them all, of course, but I'll read just the salient points. Of course, what happened, Churchill had wanted to invade Norway himself. He had got an invasion force aboard 3 cruisers. The 3 cruisers sailed. He then called them back. He unloaded the forces because he thought the German High Fleet was sailing. He had visions of another battle of Jutland. He sailed the force in the wrong direction, realized his mistake, recalled the cruisers, put the guns and the ammunition and the men back on the ships, but all on the wrong ships. He put the guns on one ship, the men on another ship, the ammunition on another ship. He landed them on different parts of the Norwegian coastline. There was a Gallipoli-like fiasco of which Churchill had proven himself so magnificently capable. The result was the fiasco which finally cost Neville Chamberlain his seat. The Germans, in the meantime, landed, a brilliantly executed, hazardous operation which cost them almost their entire navy, but they managed to carry it off. They landed everywhere. Norway invaded during the early hours this morning, so writes Captain Edwards, 9th of April. Invasions everywhere, including even Narvik. What a chance we've missed. Then later on he writes, pure cold feet, it should have been done. Winston ratted, and so did the first Sea Lord. Never win a war like this. Blast and damn them. Winston's an infernal menace, may well lose the war for us. Then April the 11th, 2 days later, a very long meeting with Winston Churchill, who was again half tight. Now, you read this reference in the original diaries as I have, written in ink. You can't mistake the handwriting, there's not a question of that. But you see that the official British historian, Captain Stephen Roskill, who quotes this in his books, has requoted it, has reworded it to read, meeting with Churchill, who was very tired. Now, there's a significant difference between half tight and very tired. Or again, July the 6th, 1944, the private diary of another sea dog, Admiral Cunningham, Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham, who became our first Sea Lord the year before this. He attended, therefore, the Cabinet meetings, the Defence Committee meetings. He, too, was horrified to find the condition Churchill was in as he conducted his war. Blind, drunk, again and again. I read out only one entry. July the 6th, 1944. There's no doubt the PM is in no state to discuss anything. Too tired and too much alcohol. He was in a terrible mood this evening, rude and sarcastic. Had a couple of blows with him about the Far East. The net result was that we sat from 10 p.m. till 1:45 a.m. listening to him talking mostly nonsense and got nowhere. And you may think that this is a bit much. The hour's getting late and you don't want to hear any more about Churchill's drunkenness, but the decisions he ordered on this particular day show what he was capable of when he was drunk. Here we have the actual documents he issued to the Chief of Staff that day, July the 6th, 1944, signed by him. He orders the dropping of poison gas bombs on German towns and cities. The opening of poison gas warfare, forbidden ever since World War I, with signed solemn conventions and treaties promising that we would never ever launch poison gas warfare without being attacked first in this manner. We'd signed the treaties, and yet here's Churchill say, do it, because the flying bomb offensive has begun against England. The V-1 flying bombs are coming over, and they're causing havoc in England. British morale is almost completely at an end. And now, out of the blue skies suddenly come the flying bomb offensive. 30,000 homes a day being wrecked in the south of London by the V-1 flying bombs. And on the 6th of July, Churchill orders the dropping of poison gas bombs. Not only poison gas, he also orders the release of 2 million anthrax bombs. Bombs laden with anthrax. Very little of this is known, of course, now, because he's our great hero. We tried one anthrax bomb on a Scottish island during the war to see its effect, and that island is uninhabitable today. It's prohibited territory. You're not allowed to set foot on it because it is still completely... Well, you're a farming community yourselves, a lot of you, and you know what anthrax does. If we had released 2 million anthrax bombs that were prepared and charged in England, if we'd released them on Germany at that time, the whole of Western Europe would still be completely uninhabitable today. Not just West Germany, of course, because it would spread, and not just for the duration of the war. In his drunken stupor, Churchill ordered even that. Heedless of the conventions, heedless of Geneva, he ordered this war crime. I want you to think very seriously over this question of poison gas, he says. And then arguing why it's reasonable to turn a blind eye on Geneva, he says, it is absurd to consider morality on this topic when everybody used it in the last war without a word of complaint from the moralists or the church. On the other hand, in the last war, the bombing of open cities was regarded as forbidden. Now everybody does it as a matter of course. It is simply a question of fashion changing, as she does, between long and short skirts for women. You imagine what the enemy would have made if the boot had been on the other foot in 1945-46, if Mr. Churchill had been in the dock at Nuremberg and the Nazis on the judge's bench. What relish they would have had in reading out a document like this. I want a cold-blooded calculation made as to how it would pay us to use poison gas. And for a month, our magnificent chiefs of staff argued against it, not on the grounds of morality, as they should have done, saying, Winston, what you are arguing for is just like your Norwegian campaign, a violation of the laws of war, a breach of the Hague Convention, a violation of the Geneva Convention on poisoning gas. It would be a war crime and you would be a war... They're not saying that to him, because nobody dares stand up to this Prime Minister. Nobody, of course, resigns. They argue on the grounds of strategy and tactical expedience. They say, the wind is blowing the wrong way for the use of poison gas. It would favor the Germans. Or they say even, they admit it, the German civilian morale is tougher than ours. We have seen what the flying bombs have done in England. If a poison gas exchange now begins, we would probably lose it. What they don't realize, of course, is that the Germans have secretly designed poison gases far more lethal than anything we had. Mustard gas and the rest of them. They were phooey. They were peanuts compared with the poison gases the Germans had designed. The Germans had the first nerve gases already stockpiled. Taboon and sarin had already been designed. The nerve gases against which we had no defense. They argue against it on these grounds, the military grounds. And Churchill replies on July the 29th, clearly I cannot make head against the Parsians and the warriors at the same time. That's Mr. Churchill, our magnificent hero, the greatest living Englishman, now, thank God, passed on. But his image is still untarnished. His image is still, unfortunately, there. We worship the image of Winston Churchill as though this man was not the gravedigger of Britain, the Empire, and all that we once held dear. We worship him, and we look around and we say to ourselves, the sad truth is that if we regard these great figures of the Second World War, Churchill, Hitler, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Truman, then there is ample evidence that power corrupts. Were there therefore no great statesmen? And the answer is, certainly from my researches, some of our Commonwealth statesmen were men of format and decency. They weren't all tarnished and corrupted by the power that they found thrust upon them. Robert Menzies, for example, of Australia, a fine man. His private diaries, which I've read in the National Library in Canberra, show him to have seen through what was going on in London. He visited London in 1941. He saw the dictatorship that Churchill was executing over his cabinet, the way that he was taking military decisions that were costing the lives of tens of thousands of Commonwealth troops, including those of Australia, and he went on around the Commonwealth blowing the whistle on Winston Churchill and his methods. And of course your own fine Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. You read his diaries in Ottawa, great shelves full of the original diaries. Ignore the printed volume by Pickersgill, the selection. You won't get the flavour of the man. Mackenzie King, there's no doubt at all that he was one of the upright, honest, decent, forthright, pious and religious leaders of the Second World. 20 years he was your Prime Minister here. I don't see very much reference to him in Canada now. You don't see many streets or buildings named after him. And yet he was one of the few decent men that the Second World War produced. And yet, for all his uprightness and decency, we can't escape the fact that dear old Mackenzie King was completely batty. He was. I mean, how else can you explain? We know this now. You read the private diaries of Mackenzie King and you see there he is talking to his dog the whole time, which is harmless enough, but he was taking advice from his dog. This is true. I mean, he was taking advice from his dog and going down and reporting to his cabinet the next day what decisions he had reached without revealing to them that it was his dog Pat who had taken the advice. And later on, of course, he's taking advice from his mother, which is even more serious. No, I mean, it's serious because his mother had been dead for 10 years. And he was consulting his mother through the uncertain medium of a medium. And again, telling the cabinet... And during the war years, of course, he hardly took a decision without consulting Adolf Hitler at night. In his sleep he would have long dreams and conversations with Hitler, sometimes long telephone conversations with Hitler, and he would go and tell the cabinet in Canada, his cabinet, his decisions the following morning without imparting to them the vital piece of intelligence that the piece of advice had been given to him during the night by Adolf Hitler himself. Now this was Mackenzie King. The most important decisions were taken by Mackenzie King, however, on the advice of the hands of the clock. Now this you don't know. The hands of the clock, if you don't know it, when they're in a straight line like 6 o'clock, that is a good omen. When they're covering each other like 1:05, that's a bad omen. And of course the hands of the clock are doing it the whole time if you keep an eye on the clock. He was a clock watcher. If you look through his diaries, Mackenzie King, August 1943, you find on some days he's dictating into his diary, day after day, 18 or 20 times what the hands of the clock are doing to him. In the midst of the famous first summit conference in Quebec, Roosevelt, Churchill, Mackenzie King, all their cabinets and chiefs of staff, Mackenzie King is consulting the hands of the clock without anybody seeing, so as to see whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that is going on at that moment. The treaty is being signed, the peace offers coming from Italy, all the rest of it, is it good or bad? Not just the rainbows outside the window, the way that the Canadian flag was fluttering before, of course, Lester Pearson destroyed it, the way the old Canadian flag was flying between the British and the American flags on the flag mast outside the Citadel. No, the hands of the clock. What he would do today with our digital watches, I think Canada would have floundered. But he never in his most evil dreams did he imagine the day would come when clocks would no longer have hands. The greatest day, which I may say in conclusion, was the 17th of August 1943. On this day, as they all arrive, Mr. Churchill is already there, President Roosevelt is arriving from Washington, Churchill has arrived with his chiefs of staff and cabinet aboard one of His Majesty's finest battleships. They go down to the Wolf's Cove station in Quebec. Churchill sitting in the car beside Mackenzie King, and he says to Mackenzie King, you know, we submitted this memorandum to you asking for 25,000 cases of whiskey and gin. And Mackenzie King replies, as he says in his what his secretary thought, of course, Mackenzie King's secretary, day by day had to type up the discs, the dictaphone discs. She must have thought to herself, the boss has gone batty. The boss has gone batty, but I'm not telling anyone because they don't want to lose my job. I mean, this is characteristic. The diaries are all there, all beautifully typed up with all the hands of the clock, all the times faithfully recorded. And on this morning, they go down to the Wolf's Cove station, and Churchill says, we need 25,000 cases of whiskey and gin most urgently because it is affecting the morale of the British officers' corps. What he means is it was affecting the morale at number 10 Downing Street. And Mackenzie King is teetotal. He's a dedicated 100% teetotal, like myself. I mean, people like us, there's no getting round us. We will not be influenced. We're convinced of our own rectitude. Mackenzie King says, if I have closed down all the refineries and distilleries as I have for the duration of the war, producing vital raw materials for this fight for the preservation of civilization, it would be most wrong of me to have to open a distillery just to produce the demon drink for yourself and your officers. You're going to have to put forward a better memorandum than you have done so far, and frankly I consider the memorandum that your Quartermaster General provided most impertinent. Churchill says, very well, if you promise to consider it most faithfully and studiously, I will have a new memorandum drawn up. And the new memorandum is drawn up. By 25th of August 1943, it's there. The memorandum of the Quartermaster General of the British Army is submitted to Mackenzie King, 20 years your Prime Minister, liberal, upright, forthright, man of integrity, teetotal, pious and religious. It arrives in his hotel suite at the Hotel Frontenac in Quebec at 25 to 8. The hands of the clock are covering each other. Mackenzie King tears it up. He says this is a sign to him. He tears the memorandum up. He tells Mr. Churchill only that he's decided to deny the application. He never explains why. But now, thanks to the truth that we find in the original documents, you know and I know, and it makes us all that little bit happier. Thank you.
Real history is quite simply history taken straight from the man who makes the history to the man who writes the history, to the book. You have here Anthony Eden, next to him a document that he's written. You may see that there are 3 lines crossed out in that document by Anthony Eden, and he's written in the margin the words, too secret to record. And next to him is an author with a document, and finally the book that the author has written. So real history is what goes straight from the history that's in the archives to the book, as I write on the back of the book, with no academic prejudice, with no political input. It's real history. It's history as it really happened. It's interesting, incidentally, this Anthony Eden document. I mentioned it on the last occasion I was here. Anthony Eden writes in the margin of that document the words, too secret to record. He crosses out those 2 lines, 2 or 3 lines in black ink and red ink, so that if you go to the archives and hold the document up against the light, you still can't read what was originally typed there by him, recording a conversation he had on December the 8th, 1942, with General Charles de Gaulle, and with 2 other French generals, and with a high mandarin of the British Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan. It incidentally refers to their plan to assassinate a foreign head of state, Admiral Darlan. It's unimportant for the purpose of this morning's topic, but it's an example of how real history can be found in the archives if you dig deep enough. If you look in the cabinet British Cabinet version of that document, those lines have vanished entirely. They're not even there. They've been crossed out. But if you look in Anthony Eden's papers, you find the original typescript draft with the lines crossed out and the words written next to them in his own red ink handwriting, "Too secret to record, A.E. Anthony Eden." It's rather amusing when you come across documents like that. I remember around about the same time as I was signing the contract for this book in 1972, and I was doing the research on the Adolf Hitler book, I came across a document in the German Foreign Office archives, again, Foreign Office diplomats. The diplomat has written a record, and from this record we know that Adolf Hitler had a meeting early in July 1940 with two Gauleiters, two provincial Nazi governors, Gauleiter Wagner and Gauleiter Bürkel, who were in charge of the westernmost German provinces, which were in fact the newly annexed or recovered French regions of Alsace and Lorraine. And meeting with these two top Nazi Gauleiters in private, Adolf Hitler drew a sketch map of the future German frontier, where it would be after the war was over, after the peace treaty. It was a pretty generous enlargement of German territory at France's expense. Germany recovered all the old German territories like Alsace, Lorraine, and quite a few other territories besides, and it was a pretty sensitive document. And Adolf Hitler ordered, at the end of this conference with these westernmost Gauleiters, he said, "Es darf kein Papier herüber entstehen." There is not to be any paper record made of what I've said today. And you wonder how I know that? It's because the diplomat who was present went back to Berlin and typed a memorandum on the conversation, ending with the words, "The Führer ordered that no record is to be taken of the conversation." Isn't that nice? And here you have Anthony Eden doing the same thing, saying, "Too secret to record." And that's how we know it happened. Anthony Eden's private diaries are in the University of Birmingham, where I have read them all through from beginning to end. And I must say it's a rather sad voyage when you read somebody's private diaries, particularly when he's dead. You read when he was a nobody, you read when he is a somebody, you read when he's failing and fading away, and you suffer all his triumphs and trials and tribulations. It is a very sad experience. I didn't know the Anthony Eden personal family story very well. I remember in 1940, I think it was, reading in the diary about how he went to Eton College to visit his son, Nicholas, who was at Eton College, which is England's premier school, or one of England's 2 or 3 premier schools. And Anthony Eden actually wrote in his diary about how distressing it was for him to stand outside the chapel at Eton College and see all the pupils streaming out with large numbers of dirty, unkempt and slovenly Jewish children as well. And that goes into his private diary, and of course he never published it, and it's not in any of the published versions of his memoirs either. All their private feelings. And then 2 years later, Nicholas, this son of whom they're so proud, goes and joins the Royal Air Force. And then when you're reading the 1944 diary, suddenly you get message from the Far East that his son Nicholas is missing. The plane has gone down somewhere in the mountains of Burma, and there's still some hope that they may find the wreckage and the son may be alive. And for the next few weeks while you're reading through the diary, you share his hopes that the son may be found. It's really very distressing to read somebody's private diary, and then eventually the word comes that the wreckage has been found. So these are the joys of writing real history. If you do the work, and you're prepared to read the handwriting, read into somebody's handwriting, which starts as being illegible, but eventually becomes very easy, then you can gather all the secrets and all the mysteries. And as I researched the life of Winston Churchill, who wrote no diary, I suppose he was too busy to write a diary. Either you're a diary-writing person or you're not. Goebbels was a diary-writing person. Eden was a diary-writing person. But Churchill wasn't. I managed to buy, or rather rent, many, many years ago, Churchill's desk diaries. He had a staff who would put on his desk each month a large new calendar pad, a large card, about 2 foot square, in which all the days of the month were printed in, and then they would be inked into these squares by himself or by his staff, all his appointments for that particular week. And the person who had them was his bodyguard, Commander Thompson. And Commander Thompson died. I don't know how the bodyguard got them, but his godson offered them for sale at Sotheby's, and he wanted £500,000 for them, which they were probably worth for the autograph value and their historic value. And eventually Sotheby's took them off the auction block because the Churchill family protested that they were stolen property, so the son offered them to me. I said, I'm not going to buy them, because I know what's going to happen with my kind of luck. 1 year later, the family comes along and takes them off me, and I don't get any refund. So anyway, I didn't have that kind of money, but I rented them. I mean, you can rent stolen property. So I rented the stolen property from the son for a year, and I made very, very good microfilm records of them. And I've just recently, in fact, this is the advance of technology, put them all on CD-ROM, so anybody can have these desk diaries who wants them. That's part of my contribution. And from these desk diaries, you can see what's happening. From the annotations, you can get a picture of what's happening. It's not so much the documents that matter sometimes as the little scribbles on them. And only recently, within the last year or two, the British government has released the records of the British Code-Breaking Agency, to which I referred in my talk yesterday. There was a sheet of intercepts, you may remember, of the SS messages from the Eastern Front. The Code-Breaking Agency was at Bletchley Park, with the innocuous title, The Government Code and Cipher School. The Government Code and Cipher School. After the war, it became known as GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters. So secret that nobody was allowed even to use the initials GCHQ. The whole British code-breaking effort was so secret that they didn't even refer to the ultra-secret. The documents were stamped with the word ultra. Nobody was allowed to use the word enigma in post-war histories. Historians weren't allowed to refer to the British code-breaking effort. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States and the British Chiefs of Staff, forming together the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which continued to rule for a year or two after World War II, ordained that no official historians were to be allowed to be told of the Allied code-breaking effort, because it was so secret. And if you wonder what the logic behind that was, surely the war was over, and even the official government historians should have been allowed at least to know about it and to write about it. In the directive of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which I quote in the introduction to this Churchill biography, you see the Combined Chiefs of Staff said, if it was ever announced that we had had such an enormous insight into the German secret internal messages, if this was made known, then this would give birth to a new stab-in-the-back legend for the Germans, and the word would get around that they had been unfairly defeated, which of course in a way they were. You can't really fight a war when both your hands are tied behind your back and your enemy is looking over your shoulder, effectively with a mirror poised above your head so he can read all your cards. And if that had become known, then the magnificent quality of the British and American victories would have been tarnished and diminished. And so the decision was taken, this fact is never going to be released or made known. And it was kept secret until 1974, when gradually the ultra-secret came out. But even then, the secret marched on in the British archives. They raided Churchill's own files, the British secret bearers. They raided Churchill's own files and weeded them of every document that referred to ultra. And in their reports, they didn't say we found 68 documents with ultra references in the Churchill files. They said we found 68 code word documents. 68 code word documents. They weren't even allowed to mention the word ultra in their own internal memoranda. It was as secret as that, which is an indication of how the secret was kept. Now, the reason I'm mentioning Bletchley Park and the Government Code and Cipher School is that I have found evidence within the last 2 years that this was the British terminal of a secret transatlantic link between Churchill and Roosevelt. Churchill and Roosevelt conducted an open correspondence with each other, which is in the public libraries now. A multi-volume series of the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence has been published. Even in the early years after the war, publishing that series was a major diplomatic effort because each government had to consult the other about whether they were going to be permitted to quote this telegram or that. And eventually most of the telegrams were released, and finally all of the telegrams were released. And if you read the publication by Warren F. Kimball, who is a professor at Rutgers University, you have the impression that that is it. There is no more to be found. And you can imagine with what astonishment I therefore came across, scattered through the thousands of files of the Bletchley Park documents, which are in the British Public Record Office under the designation, the Class HW. It's Class HW for those of you who are historians. You go there and you look in file HW1, and you find all sorts of messages from a man called C to Winston Churchill. And in your packets, those of you who arrived early will have found in your yellow welcoming packages this document. This is just one sample, which causes us to raise our eyebrows as historians. I have a few more copies here. I've got one more copy here and a few more on the back, and I'm quite happy to print out more copies later. Or those of you who've acquired the book will find that I've actually reproduced this document in the appendix at the back. You'll see this is the document signed C. C always used blue notepaper. In England, it's known as Basildon Bond paper. My name is Bond, Basildon Bond. Here we have C signing it. C was in fact Sir Stuart Menzies, M-E-N-Z-I or M-E-N-Z-I-E-S, the head of the British Secret Service. And he's writing a letter to Churchill saying, Prime Minister, I enclose a copy of a telegram. I enclose a copy of a telegram which has been received through my channels, addressed to you from the President. Now we know who the President was. I attached the relevant BJs, as well as Berlin Press Directive of 18th of January. This is 1944. BJs, I can explain, are an anagram. We're not quite sure what of. It may originally have been British-Japanese, British intercepts of Japanese messages. Some people say, well, it actually refers to the blue jackets in which the documents came, the blue folders. I've seen them referred to in the private diary of the Deputy Chief of the British General Staff as the Black Jumbos, and they were also referred to quite freely in conversation as the Black Jumbos. The BJs were the intercepts. Not necessarily intercepts of Japanese messages, they were decodes and decrypts of any diplomatic message. In this case, I think it was a Spanish telegram that had been intercepted by the British code breakers and duly deciphered. But what is significant here, of course, is that this is a letter which is being sent to Churchill through my channels, through British Secret Service channels, SAS channels. It's being delivered to Churchill by the head of a Secret Service, and it's coming through Secret Service channels, and it's never been published. It's one of a series. And Churchill has written across the document in his typical red ink, S of S Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, pray comment on this if you can. WSC, 20th of January 1944. It all went with lightning speed, you see. It's all the same day. I'm not quite sure where the link was at the American end. I think the American end terminal was effectively Sir William Stevenson, the head of the British Secret Service in the United States. You may know of him as the man called Intrepid. That was the title of a book written by another William Stevenson, an extraordinary coincidence, an author with the same name but a different spelling, who wrote the biography of Sir William Stevenson. The Canadian, based in New York. He had a 00 code number from the British Secret Service. He was the head of the British Secret Service in the United States, a close friend of Winston Churchill, a close confidant. He ran the Secret Service in this country. He carried out the sabotage and the assassinations as dictated from London. The messages went from Stevenson to C, to Menzies, to Churchill. And they went from Roosevelt to Stevenson. And that was the channel that was used. I think in the United States they used the FBI wireless transmitting station on Chesapeake Bay. I went once to interview the man who was in charge of the American end of that. He lived outside a town called McLean, which has some kind of connection, I understand, with the Secret Service in this country. And I visited this gentleman about 20 years ago, and the conversation lasted only 35 seconds on his doorstep. And I told him what I was there for. He said, "I'm afraid I can't talk to you." He shut the door. So he knew more than he was prepared to talk about. The Americans gradually learned of this secret communication channel between Churchill and Roosevelt. And this may surprise that I put it like that. Roosevelt was communicating with Churchill, and his own diplomatic service, the State Department, didn't know it was going on. We know this was the case because the Undersecretary of State in the United States, a man called Adolph Burley, B-E-R-L-E, writes a very full diary, daily diary, which is in the Roosevelt archives. And he describes paying a visit to Lord Halifax, who was the British ambassador in Washington, early in 1942 to ask him about rumors that there was a flood of top-secret code messages going through the FBI link to England and coming back through the same channels, of which the State Department were not aware. And the record written by Burley in his private diary says, "I took this up with Sir William Stevenson." Effectively, I'm paraphrasing this. I had to be careful because in the court in London I was accused of distorting documents when I quoted them like this from memory. It's a document I read 20 years ago. So paraphrasing, Burley writes in his diary, "I took this up with Sir William Stevenson," and Stevenson implied that it reflects a series of top-secret messages between the President and the Prime Minister. Whereupon Burley went to see Lord Halifax to ask him about it. And Lord Halifax said that he had questioned Stevenson about it, and Stevenson denied it. But Burley writes in his diary, "As I left him, I could see there was something of a sneer on Lord Halifax's face, and I think there's been some tall lying going on around here," which is a nice way of putting it. I quoted the actual passage in the Churchill biography. So these two great statesmen were communicating with each other through the back door, and only allowing the Foreign Office in England and the State Department in the United States to know about these communications and what was in them, whatever the President and the Prime Minister saw to be fit. I'd like to know what is in the rest of that communications exchange, and I've written to the British government about it, and I've asked them to search their archives. And we had a conference in the British Archives, the Public Record Office, on a very similar subject 6 weeks ago, which I attended, and there was the head of the Bletchley Park archive system there as one of the lecturers. And that was the question I put to her. I said, "Is there still in your secret archives of Bletchley Park a Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence file?" And she said she wasn't aware of one. And I drew her attention to another document like this from the same file, which actually had at the top, written in handwriting, the word PM file, PM's file, Prime Minister's file, indicating that there was a special file kept at Bletchley Park for this secret channel of correspondence. We don't know what's in the channel of correspondence. I put in the appendix to this book a number of examples which are scattered through these thousands of HW1 files, which clearly indicate that it was matters of a top-secret nature when a message was intercepted from Hitler to the German High Command using the teleprinter code machine network known as the Geheimschreiber. The Germans called it the Geheimschreiber, the secret writer, the secret teleprinter. The British codebreakers called it fish. And they then assigned to each of the different kinds of code within that group various kinds of fish names, like tunny and sturgeon and so on. I don't think there was a Jewfish among them, but so they may have been. I don't know if that name of fish is still allowed in this country or not. I understand that the Anti-Defamation League is protesting about this association. A shark would probably be better. There was actually a code called, I know it's unfortunate, in Virginia Beach and Florida and all that now, but there was actually a code named Shark. And the Geheimschreiber revealed in October 1943 that Hitler had changed his strategy in northern Italy and was reassigning certain lines of defense to Kesselring, who was in charge of the defense of northern Italy. And there's a top-secret correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt about that, which went through this secret link, of vital importance if you're writing the history of that period. But we don't know exactly what was said, because it's only reflected in the covering letters like this, and the fact that such telegrams went and were responded to, we're not entirely sure what they were. And of course, somewhere in the United States, there must be the corresponding mirror image of the correspondence. Probably not in the Hyde Park Library of President Roosevelt. It's probably in the NSA or at Arlington Hall or one of the other centers of archival depositories of the intelligence system in this country. This is what makes writing history such fun. Because we're looking constantly for something which we suspect is there, and you get a clue that it's there, and then it's your duty to dig deeper. And of course, if you're a conformist historian sitting in your book-lined cave plucking the books off the shelves, you're never going to find that kind of thing. Because the lines have been scratched out and they don't exist. Because you can't dig deeper in a book-lined library. You've got to go into the archives and start looking at the abstruse files. You've got to spend 3 or 4 days trawling through hundreds and hundreds of files and finding nothing at all. And you may be a bit sleepy that afternoon. You may have been moving it up the night before, and you flip over a page, and you missed the important penciled note at the top of the page, which tells you, yes, there was a file called the PM's file. But and you've got to have a long stamina. It's a long-winded research. I can tell you I have a file in the bottom of one of my filing cabinets in London, which is called the transatlantic telephone traffic between Churchill and the President, which is the other arm of my talk this morning. At the beginning of October 1939, the phone rang in Churchill's apartment in Morpeth Mansions in London, not far from Parliament. He had a seedy little kind of one-up apartment in this mansion block, and a Victorian block. I went and visited it once. His apartment was up for sale, and I could have exchanged it for mine, and I thought that would be really ironic if I could go and live in Churchill's old apartment. And the phone rang in that apartment around about October the 3rd. The war had been running for a month, and Churchill was Navy Minister in England. He was the first Lord of the Admiralty, as he's known. He wasn't the Prime Minister at that time. And it was the President of the United States phoning him. Now, this alone is an unusual fact, because etiquette dictates that presidents as heads of state, or presidents even as first ministers, can't telephone a minister in a foreign administration. It would have to go through the Prime Minister of the foreign administration, who would then pass it on. But no, the phone rang in Churchill's apartment, and it was the President himself. And Churchill was dining that evening with a couple of admirals, and he excused himself and went into the next room and took the call, and he came back looking very satisfied. And a correspondence started at that time between Churchill as a minister for the Navy in Britain and Roosevelt as President of the United States. I say started, but it may well be resumed, because, of course, the fact that the first letters between the two are in October 1939 doesn't mean to say there was no other channel of communication they used. I suspect that one channel they used was Felix Frankfurt, the eminent Justice of the Supreme Court in this country. There are references to that in Frankfurt's private diary in the Library of Congress, which indicates that he was conveying messages between the two men at that time. Churchill desperately wanted to bring the United States into the war, rather than making some kind of unsatisfactory peace with Adolf Hitler. And he had started communicating through these backdoor channels in a totally unconstitutional manner, and reprehensible manner, one would think, behind the back of Neville Chamberlain, his own Prime Minister, with a foreign head of state. Simultaneously, his son was taking up conversations with the Soviet government through the ambassador in London, Ivan Maisky. I know that from the Moscow archives. There are records in the Moscow archives of Maisky's telegrams reporting these conversations. Interestingly, of course, in 1940, and greatly to the embarrassment of Winston Churchill, it turned out that the code clerk in the American embassy in London, a man called Tyler Gatewood Kent, about whom Mr. Mark Webber may want to tell us something in the discussion period, was making secret, furtive copies of this correspondence that went on between Churchill and Roosevelt through the American embassy. He was so incensed by the fact that a British minister was trying to drag his country, the United States, into a war which was no concern of the United States, that Gatewood Kent thought it his patriotic duty, Tyler Kent thought it was his patriotic duty, to make copies of these telegrams, only about a dozen or so of which we know in that period of the first months of 1940 between the two men. And eventually, in May 1940, Tyler Kent was arrested by the British Secret Service, by MI5, and at the request of the American government, instead of being repatriated to the United States to be put on trial as a traitor, because he was intending to turn these documents over to the Germans to humiliate and embarrass the British, the Americans requested that Tyler Kent should be put on trial in Britain, and he was stripped of his diplomatic immunity so that he could be put on trial in the famous Old Bailey and locked away. Nobody would hear about him. So the whole Tyler Kent story was kept under wraps until the end of the war, when he was sent back to the United States, and of course by that time the whole picture had changed. What is interesting about the Tyler Kent story is that it mirrored the fact that there was a secret channel of communication at that time between Churchill and Roosevelt, where they were using at that time State Department channels and US Navy Department channels to conduct correspondence. In May 1940, on May the 10th, Churchill became Prime Minister, and the picture shifted slightly. But Churchill had this conspiratorial furtive element about him, if I can put it like that. Throughout the war, throughout my Volume 1 and Volume 2, you'll see that he repeatedly sends out a commander to do a job. He sends an admiral to Norway. He sends a general to Dunkirk. He sends a general out to the Western Desert in North Africa. And he then, at the same time as he sends this man out to do the job, he says, here's a secret code you can use to communicate directly with me, bypassing the War Office, bypassing the Admiralty. It was typical Churchill that he would always set up this back door so that these commanders could communicate directly with him and give him direct information, that he could issue direct orders to them. To Lord Gort, he sends a telegram at the time of Dunkirk saying, you are to advance to the coast. I mean, history would say you are to retreat to the beaches, but no, you are to advance to the coast, and you are not to inform your allies to the left and right what you are doing, which is the most shameful act in a coalition war. That you pull your own army, the British army, out of the expeditionary force, the British expeditionary force, you pull it out of the line in France, because the Germans are pouring forward, and you don't tell the unfortunate Belgians and French that you're doing this. You leave them just hanging in midair, because you're going to get to safety if you possibly can. And that shameful telegram is in the French files, not in the British files. It's been taken out of the British files. But I found it in the files of the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, in France. I visited his widow at that time in the 1970s, still alive, one-armed widow, with her one remaining arm. I persuaded her to sign an authorization for me to see her husband's papers. And there was this shameful telegram in the French papers, in the Paul Reynaud papers. This telegram that Churchill sent using his private line of communication to Lord Gort, who was the general in charge. And he did the same with Admiral Cork at the time of the Norwegian expedition in April 1940, which ended with the fiasco, which ironically left Churchill in charge as Prime Minister, because the fiasco in Norway resulted in a debacle which caused the overthrow, the downfall of the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and his place was taken, regrettably I would say, by Winston Churchill. And he did the same in North Africa when he established a private line of communication with Claude Auchinleck, the British Commander-in-Chief in North Africa, until the summer of 1942. And the War Office was repeatedly distressed to find that Churchill was communicating directly, behind its back, with this commander in the field. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on whether it was a good or a bad thing that Churchill had this dual line of communication through official channels and through unofficial channels. His subordinates, like General Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, were such weak characters that they didn't really protest effectively enough. They should have said, either Winston, you sever that link, or I resign, because it's completely impossible for me to run the General Staff if you're going to go behind my back repeatedly and issue orders to the Commanders-in-Chief and undermine what I'm doing. So it was in Churchill's nature to establish these private links. Now, what about that telephone conversation in October 1939? How did it come? Well, there was a radio-telephone link at the same time as there was a transatlantic cable. The transatlantic telephone cable was in its infancy. It didn't carry very much traffic, and at the beginning of World War II, it was decided to cut the cable to make it impossible for the enemy to tap into the telephone cable. So, ironically, all traffic by telephone across the Atlantic went thereafter by radio telephone through a scrambler system. It was scrambled. The scrambler system had been made by a German firm, effectively. They'd designed it. The patent was a patent of the Siemens Corporation, and it's no surprise, therefore, when we learn that the radio telephone link across the Atlantic had been unscrambled by the Germans, and they were listening into every telephone conversation that they could intercept. After they had invaded the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium and France, they set up, near The Hague, a listening post. The listening post was in a direct line of sight, so to speak, between the American end at Washington, London, and The Hague. So they were catching the back traffic, the radio traffic. They could listen in very clearly to all the radio traffic going across the Atlantic, and within no time at all they were recording hundreds upon thousands of these conversations that went across the Atlantic by radio telephone. I'll say straight away that this very unsatisfactory state of affairs from our point of view lasted until the end of 1943. 4 years at least. How do we know this? In the private papers of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, you'll find the transcripts of the conversations. You won't find them in the British archives. You won't find them in the American archives, but you find them in the archives of the SS, scattered around these intercepts of Churchill's telephone conversations. Isn't that extraordinary? But the extraordinary thing is that they had intercepted thousands of these conversations, and only a few of them survive in the German archives. None in the British archives, and none in the American archives. So now you can understand why I've got that very faded and battered file slot in the bottom of my filing cabinet in London for over 30 years, into which I've been putting sedulously every page of paper I can find referring to these intercepts. Because therein lies the tale, in my view. Ignore the Warren Kimball, beautifully printed volumes of Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence. That's not where you'll find the real history. Ignore the Churchill archives in Cambridge. Ignore the Public Record Office, because they're not going to help us on this. You've got to try and find the transcripts of those conversations between those men, because that's where the history was decided between these two. Look at the private diary, not of Adolf Burley, not of Henry Stimson or somebody like that. Look in other private diaries. Look in the diary of the Secretary of Agriculture, Claude F. Wickard. I was sitting one day in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, and sitting opposite me was Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger himself, the grand guru, the historian on President Roosevelt. And we recognized each other instantly, I would like to say. Anyway, he knew of my works. He said, "Hey, I've read your book, Hitler's War Grateful." And we went and had lunch together. And I said, "What do you make of that conversation in November 1941 that Roosevelt had with his cabinet?" There was no Roosevelt cabinet, but there was a kind of a kitchen cabinet where Roosevelt called in all his ministers. And unlike the British cabinet, which kept detailed, meticulous records, which are sanitized, of the cabinet meetings, there are no records of the American cabinet meetings. No official record was kept, no minute was taken, which makes it difficult to write history. Were it not for the people who sat around the table, chewing their fingernails, biting their pencils, and writing private diaries afterwards. Claude Wickard. And Schlesinger said, "What do you mean, the Wickard diary?" And I said, "You haven't read the Wickard diary then. It's up there on the shelves here in the library." The original handwritten diary of Claude Wickard, the Secretary of Agriculture. He said, "Well, Jesus, perhaps I ought to have a look at it then." And that's what encourages me when I find that even a great historian, a truly great historian like Schlesinger, it hasn't occurred to him to read the diary of the Secretary of Agriculture because you think agriculture doesn't really play much of a part in the war, does it? It does, of course. You can't fight a war without a good harvest. Look at 1939. Look at 1938, the Munich Treaty. So, what do we find in the Wickard diary? He's writing a record of every Friday cabinet meeting that President Roosevelt holds. And on, I think, November the 4th, or thereabouts, 1941, a month before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt says, "I had a conversation a day or two ago with Churchill, with the Prime Minister. He wants us to go ahead with a preemptive strike against Japan." I'm saying again, I am recalling this from memory, just in case there's any lawyers here making records who are going to have me up in court a month from now or a year from now saying that's not exactly what he said. You'll find the exact quotation in my volume. I've quoted this particular passage. Roosevelt says, "I was talking it over with Churchill a day or two ago, and he wants us to deliver a preemptive strike against Japan." And suddenly it makes sense when you look at the maps of the operations staff of George Marshall, where they've got concentric rings centered on the Philippines, and they've sent the B-17 bombers out there, and the rings are designed to show whether they can reach Tokyo yet with the B-17 bombers they sent out to the Philippines. And then you understand what the planning is going on in it, because these two men are up to something. So why did they get in this mess with Japan? Well, you look a bit further back and you find that there's a record in the papers of Harry Hopkins of a telephone conversation between Hopkins and Roosevelt from Chequers, Churchill's home, at the end of July, I think it's July the 25th, 26th, 1941. In the middle of the night, Churchill telephones the president, and Hopkins comes in and joins him, and the two of them telephone the president, and they're talking about the need to issue sanctions against Japan. And those of you who are familiar with the story of the run-up to Pearl Harbor know that the sanctions against Japan were what triggered the Japanese decision to go ahead with the attack, because they were effectively going to run out of oil 3 months from now. And the important question is who took the decision not just to issue general sanctions against Japan, the delivery of war materials, the purchase of silk and so on, but to add an oil embargo. The oil embargo against Japan that was pronounced on, I think, July the 26th, 1941, was what brought about Pearl Harbor. Originally, Roosevelt told his cabinet that no way would he go along with an oil embargo, because he knew that would mean war. When the sanctions are pronounced on July the 26th, they include the oil embargo. And my own theory, presumption, for which I have not the slightest shred of evidence apart from circumstantial, is that it was agreed between the two men in that telephone conversation in the middle of the night that you've got to add oil to it. And Churchill was reassuring Roosevelt, go ahead, put in the oil embargo, because believe me, the Japanese are not going to make war when push comes to shove. Churchill believed throughout 1941 that the Japanese weren't serious with their threat. But we don't know because we don't have the transcripts. The conversations were definitely recorded at the British end because one of the British censors, a woman, still alive, recorded her reminiscences on the BBC radio about a year ago. And she recalls very deeply, very clearly, Winston Churchill making the telephone calls to Roosevelt. She doesn't recall very much about what they actually talked about, which is a good thing, because we would have got a bowdlerized version. She recalls the external details, that Churchill didn't like being interrupted and reminded of the censorship warnings. They weren't allowed to talk about strategic plans. They had to use code words. They had to use euphemisms. They weren't allowed to identify themselves. You'll find there's one hilarious telephone call that Anthony Eden makes in this book, my second volume. Anthony Eden telephones Winston Churchill on May the 21st, 1943. I'm sorry, Churchill telephones Anthony Eden. Churchill is in Washington, visiting Washington, on May the 21st, 1943, and Roosevelt has read him the riot act over General de Gaulle, who's becoming increasingly obstreperous, more communist-aligned, more hostile to the Allied cause, causing increasing difficulties, and Roosevelt is dropping broad hints that it is time to terminate General de Gaulle with extreme prejudice, to use modern language. And Churchill telephones Anthony Eden, who's running the show back in London. Churchill telephones Anthony Eden, and the two of them use code names for each other, and they use code names for everybody else. And Churchill tells Anthony Eden that the president here has caused him immense problems over Joan of Arc. Everybody understood who Joan of Arc was. That was Charles de Gaulle. And the president has insisted that immediate steps should be taken to get rid of him. And the conversation goes on like this, and we know that this conversation took place because it was intercepted by the American Navy and transcribed. You wonder why the American Navy had anything to do with this. Well, the answer is that the American Censorship Bureau that was set up at the time of Pearl Harbor divided these censorship jobs into various fields, and this interception of telegraphic and telephone communications abroad and overseas was the job of the U.S. Navy. They had the best capability, and under a man called Captain Fenn, F-E-N-N, the Censorship Bureau was set up, and Captain Fenn sent a telegram to the State Department that night with the transcript of the conversation between these two Englishmen, which has been intercepted. And halfway down the transcript it says, at this point the conversation was interrupted, and we are able to identify who the speakers were, because when traffic was resumed, the London end came on and said, hello, is that you, Winston? So forget about the need for secrecy. Churchill on one occasion telephoned the White House when he was in Florida and said, I'm going to be coming back from Florida to Washington on Tuesday. I can't tell you the means I'll be using for security reasons, but it'll be a choo-choo. So he wasn't all that security conscious. And this is an important thing to remember, because in October 1943, the Americans were fully aware from code breaking that the Germans were listening into the radio telephone line across the Atlantic. And of course, this gets very difficult because you can't reveal how you know these things. So George Marshall sends an angry message to Harry Hopkins in the White House, saying somebody's got to have a word with both the President and Roosevelt and Churchill about their loose talk on the transatlantic radio telephone. In his conversation this morning, of which we've seen a transcript, Churchill has been extremely frank about the coming strategic planning and operations, and it's going to endanger lives. That's what it's all about. There's quite a file of correspondence between Roosevelt and Marshall and the White House on this issue of Churchill's loose talk on the transatlantic telephone. And the infuriating thing is, we know from the British end and from the American end that transcripts were made of these conversations. At the American end, as I say, the US Navy Department made the transcripts on behalf of the Office of Censorship, the Bureau of Censorship. You ask where the records of the Office of Censorship are, and the answer is in the National Archives under seal in perpetuity. President Truman, at the end of World War II, issued an executive order that the records of the Bureau of Censorship were to be kept sealed in perpetuity. No one was to be allowed to see the actual transcripts or the letters that were intercepted. There was a corresponding office at the English end, the Department of Postal and Telegraphic Censorship, under Sir Edwin Herbert, who actually advised the Americans on how to run such an operation. At that time, the Americans took advice from us. We effectively set up the CIA for you. We sent over the British Secret Service, and we set up, first of all, the OSS. We provided the initial officers for the OSS, and eventually the Americans took it over after we had set the operation up. The same with the Bureau of Censorship. We told you how to open letters without letting it be seen that they've been opened, how to intercept radio traffic, and so on. At the British end, the records show quite clearly that transcripts were also made. The directives state that the person who initiates the conversation is to have a transcript made. So somebody sat down there writing a longhand record of every telephone conversation. And these transcripts have vanished. And they're going to be worth looking for. I have had a 35-year search for them, both at the American end and at the English end, looking for the transcripts of the telephone conversations between Roosevelt and the Prime Minister in England, because that is where we're going to find out the real hidden history of World War II, how these two men steered things and guided public opinion and took the decisions while still leaving their general staffs in the blithe belief that they were the ones who called the shots. They didn't. And that's what this talk has been about. Thank you very much. Now, we can have a discussion about that, and you can ask questions, and I'm sure some of you have questions to ask. You will find I've dealt very extensively with both topics in the two appendices at the back of this volume. One appendix on the subject of the radio-telephone link across the Atlantic with all the records, and another appendix on the subject of this secret channel between Roosevelt and Churchill using the Secret Service link, but through which they exchange code messages. Yes?
I've heard of the Venona.
The Venona secret messages, yes.
You didn't mention anything about the Soviet Union archives.
Yes.
That those, because they had supposedly...
Well, we had a very extensive discussion about Venona. I'll give a brief overview of what Venona was. Early on in the war and throughout the war, the British and American codebreakers and radio intercept services built up a very large file of intercepted messages that were passing between the capitals, London and Washington and Moscow, going to the KGB. Very evidently radio traffic concerning espionage activities. And I'm not sure where the word Venona comes from. I think this was one of the code words that was assigned by the NSA, or the wartime equivalent of the NSA, to this traffic. It was very, very difficult to decode, for the reason that it was encoded using what were called one-time pads. A one-time pad was a sheet of paper with random letters and numbers on it, which was used to pick out the equivalent when you're writing a code message. And as long as each sheet of paper you used was absolutely different from any other sheet of paper in the universe, then that was totally undecipherable. But of course, there's no such thing as a sheet of paper with random numbers across it that is totally different from any other sheet of paper with random numbers in the universe. Eventually, there will become evident systematic similarities in the pages, particularly if they're all printed by one printer or something like that. And if you're lazy, and if you're running short of one-time pads, as eventually you will, otherwise you're going to need stacks and stacks of 30,000 sheets just to write one brief message to someone, something like that. So lazy cryptographers would go back to a used one-time pad and reuse it, indicating to the Moscow end, I'm reusing pad number so-and-so, so-and-so. I'm putting it in simple terms as I understand it. And as soon as they do that, a little chink of light comes through for the code breakers. And they can begin looking at the similarities between the patterns to decode the message in front of them. They don't get all of it. They may only get 3 letters in a whole message. They may get 2 words. But eventually, the more times that particular error is repeated, if they have enough men working on it, and you can begin to understand the mind-breaking task this was for the code breakers, sitting there month after month, getting absolutely nowhere at all, looking at meaningless jumbles of letters. But then gradually little chinks of light began to come through, and they would illuminate one message after another. And they built up a huge file of all the intercepted messages, the Venona messages, and they would crawl backwards and forwards through this file of messages, playing them off against each new page of the one-time pad that had been accidentally reused by the cipher officer, until they built up more and more of the contents of each message. And the whole Venona file has now been released by the NSA in this country, and you can see there, I think it's something like 100 messages altogether that they've managed to make sense of. Some of them they made sense of all of them, some of them made sense of none of them, some of them they've only got the sender and the recipient. Most of them use code names for the people they're talking about, but you can work out who it is because the code names are sometimes very transparent. I'm repeating to you what I've learned at this PRO, Public Record Office session in England about 6 weeks ago on the Venona case. It doesn't really concern what I've been talking about here, though. That is the thin end of that particular story. It's a fascinating subject. The code-breaking messages are the ones that are the most important, in my view. I tried to explain this to the High Court in London, that when you're looking at message, I asked one witness or another, Donald Watt, Professor Watt, I said, when you're looking at the quality of documents in front of you, how would you rank them for reliability as a historical source? Would I be right in saying that right at the bottom of that table you would put eyewitness evidence, and right at the top of that table you would put code-breaking intercepts? Because code-breaking intercepts, they have no reason to be spurious or euphemistic, because the man who's writing it believes it's written in a secure code that nobody can read except the authorized recipient. And somewhere between you've got prisoner of war reports and captured documents and things like that. Captured document, of course, may always be deliberately planted on you. But a code-breaking message isn't necessarily, is less likely to be a plant. I said is less likely to be a plant because there are suspicions that the Japanese knew that we were reading their so-called purple code. We knew that they knew we knew it, if I put it like that, because we intercepted German messages in which the Germans told the Japanese that they had understood in Washington that the Americans were reading the purple code. So there, after that point, which is May 1941, you've got to look at every purple message with a little bit of a suspicion, saying, well, although we appear to have cracked this message about Honolulu, and the man in Honolulu being given orders to provide an exact grid chart of the layout of the battleships in Battleship Row and Pearl Harbor, is this something the Japanese want us to know that they've ordered? It becomes quite complicated once you know the enemy knows that you know, so to speak. But I think that the Japanese forgot that we knew about Pearl Harbor. It's as simple as that. So we're off your Venona track. But as I say, Venona has nothing to do with Churchill or Roosevelt. Yes.
Would it be correct to presume that the Germans knew of Japanese plans to bomb Pearl Harbor? And if they did, once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it's my understanding that Germany was under no treaty obligation to declare war, but rather exercised their discretion. I could be wrong on that, but the final part of my question is, why then did Hitler exercise his discretion to declare war on the United States?
3 totally separate questions, right?
Yes.
Starting with the last one, Hitler decided to attack to attack the United States quite simply because the United States was already at war with Germany. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, repeatedly came to Hitler and said that the U.S. Navy has been given orders to shoot on sight. Our submarines are operating at extreme disadvantage in the North Atlantic. Repeatedly, we're getting U.S. warships under our periscope sights so we could torpedo them. We're hamstrung by the orders you've issued, which prevent us from doing that, even though these are obviously warships engaged in offensive actions against us. Please make a formal declaration of war which enables us to do what we're there for. Because otherwise we're losing the war in the Atlantic without even being able to fight it. So Hitler was just regularizing a status quo, that the war in the Atlantic already existed. What Hitler didn't anticipate when he declared war on the United States, he thought it was a cheap declaration to make because the United States was going to have its hands tied fighting Japan. He didn't expect the United States to take the unexpected step of declaring Germany first, that we will deal with Germany first and then turn around and settle the Japanese problem, which was, in fact, a strategic miscalculation of war-losing proportions, because if you think about it, Japan couldn't have won the war without Germany being still in the war. And the moment Germany was out of the war, Japan's fate was sealed. So it was quite obvious that the Americans would have to deal with Germany first, unless public opinion and sentiment over Pearl Harbor grabbed the American lion by its tail and swung it round to face across the Pacific. This brings back the question of whether the Germans knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. They didn't know about the intention to attack Pearl Harbor. There had been serious hints dropped by the Japanese ambassador Oshima, General Hiroshi Oshima, who was the very capable Japanese ambassador in Berlin, over the previous few days. He had said things like, you must understand, he'd said this to Ribbentrop, the German Foreign Minister, you must understand that we need some kind of word from you about what your steps will be. Things may happen sooner than you can imagine. Japanese being an ambiguous language, that kind of sentence could be translated several ways, but the meaning was quite clear, that if you hesitate, he who hesitates is lost. We are about to do something, and this is the time for you to run your colors up the mast as well. I know from Hitler's own personal staff, who described it to me, that when the word of Pearl Harbor came, Hitler was completely stunned. He'd never anticipated this. It had come at a very low point in his own fortunes. On December the 2nd or 3rd, the Soviets had begun a counter-offensive. The German army in the east was in a desperate position. Its tanks weren't starting in the extreme cold. The guns weren't firing. The explosives were fizzing. The German army was all but lost. It was in retreat and abandoning its heavy equipment. And Hitler was in a very sorry pass when the word came that night. His press chief, Dietrich, the man who's at the back of the big color poster, which I had back there, and you'll see him on the photographs in some of my books. His press chief, Dietrich, came in with the first news agency report of the attack on the Japanese fleet in Pearl Harbor. And Hitler was overwhelmed with delight, and his foreign minister liaison officer, a man called Walter Hewel, H-E-W-E-L, who wrote a private diary which his widow gave to me to use. Typically, I said to the widow, why is it you've not given this to Hilgruber or any of the other established historians? She said, Mr. Irving, they never asked me for it. They sit in their book-lined caves, these conformist historians, and don't bother to ask. And in this handwritten diary, Walter Hewel wrote down Hitler's words that night. He says, now we can't possibly lose this war. We have an ally now who hasn't been defeated in 1,000 years. And then he thought of it, and then he said, of course, we've got another ally, meaning the Italians, who've constantly been defeated. However, they've always ended up on the right side. Of course, that was prophetic words. And I used to say, when I went around the world lecturing in the old days, when I could go around the world lecturing, I used to say, I think it was Napoleon who once said, the Italians had never managed to end up on the same side that they started the war on, except for one occasion in history when they changed sides twice. And there was one Italian family who got up and walked out in indignation from the lecture there when I said that. Everybody else thought it was very droll. You had a middle question, which I've forgotten, but the second part of your question. Yes, I thought so too.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Michael Hoffman. Yes.
It's fair to say that the British Secret Service had far surpassed the German equivalent, the Abwehr, and would you attribute that to Canaris being a double agent? It seems to me that most of the German codes were being read by the British, and very little of the British and American traffic had been penetrated by the Germans.
That's not entirely true. That again is a multifaceted question. The British Secret Service was very good. We had expended a huge sum of money on the British Secret Service, and we had a complete faith in it. George Marshall, at the equivalent period, at the beginning of World War II, the Chief of Staff of the United States Forces, he had very little faith in code breaking. with the result that at the outbreak of war, we had thousands of code breakers working in secret encampments. We had, as I said yesterday, 3,000 code breakers working on the German police codes alone, which you may find was a very unrewarding field of research, except that the German police were scattered across the entire Nazi empire. And whenever there was an air raid on Hamburg or Kassel or Hanover, the local police, with their telephone lines down, would use the radio teleprinter to send code messages reporting the damage, reporting public morale, reporting all the problems, which factories had been destroyed, and so on, which Bomber Harris in England had on his desk next day in consequence. So the police codes were very well worth following in England, and we did that. You asked a question, were we better than Canaris's Abwehr? Well, I knew the widow of Canaris. I corresponded and visited her once when I was on the hunt for the Canaris diaries. Canaris wrote diaries, which exist somewhere, but I think they're buried and someone's forgotten where they are. Perhaps some widow threw them out with her late husband's papers, I don't know. Canaris, in my view, was incompetent. I don't know how he kept his job or got his job, probably through favoritism. I know that he was very close to Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of the German High Command, who protected him, and was deeply shocked and felt betrayed when it turned out that Canaris had been harboring treacherous thoughts. Canaris was finally hanged on April the 8th, 1945, in Flossenburg concentration camp. And because by that time the Gestapo had raided his files, had found the diaries and established that he had been plotting to overthrow Hitler and that he had been harboring these treacherous thoughts. It has always attracted the attention of historians of a certain bent, the question whether Canaris was hand in glove with the British Secret Service. I don't think he was. I would have been inclined years ago to say, being by nature conspiracy theorist, probably he was, but having worked now so extensively in the archives that have been released, I've not found the slightest trace of it. Neither first order nor second order nor third order evidence, no reference in private diaries, nobody hinting at our man at the top level in Hitler's headquarters, nothing that you would expect to find were that the case. I think that Canaris damaged the Nazi cause by his bungling and by the fact that he was so easily duped by our extremely clever deception tactics. I'll give you one example of how we duped him, and this is the case of the famous Man Who Never Was. It's dealt with in this book, Churchill's War, Volume 2. We took a corpse of a gardener, a Welsh gardener, who had tried to kill himself, or succeeded in killing himself finally, by swallowing a weed killer of a certain kind which left very few traces on the body. And we promoted that corpse of this Welshman to a Marine officer, dressed him in Marine uniform, kept him beautifully preserved for a couple of months, and then floated him out of a torpedo tube in a submarine off the coast of Spain, chained round his neck a courier's valise containing top-secret letters from London to Mountbatten and Eisenhower and others, revealing accidentally the location of the coming-in next operation in the Mediterranean. Not against Sicily. Oh, no, that's the grand decoy operation that we hope the Germans are going to fall for. We're going to be invading Greece at the other end of the Mediterranean. But it was all done beautifully. Heavy-handed British humour. I hope you're going to bring back a few cans of sardines. Ho, ho. Sardinia, this kind of thing, if the other operation has to go ahead instead. And the whole operation, I've read the whole file through now. It's just been released in England, The Man Who Never Was. The whole file is there with the way that the body was prepared, the way that everything that was put into his pockets was prepared. The dance hall tickets, the phony existence that was created for him, the letters from a bank manager asking about this £4, 7 shillings and 6pence overdraft, and when was going to be returned, and his efforts to deal with the overdraft because he wanted to buy a ring for the fiancée that he had just met at the dance hall, and sure, there was the dance hall ticket in the other pants pocket. Beautifully prepared, the way that this man's phony identity was created, because they knew that the Gestapo would check up in England through its agents to find out if there was such a dance hall, and was there a dance that night, because the evidence contained in these letters was of such strategic importance that the Gestapo would undoubtedly go to enormous lengths to check it up. So the body was floated ashore. It landed off Cadiz. The Spanish Secret Service got hold of it. They got hold of the case. British naval attaché in Madrid, who had been tipped off to keep an eye open for word of a marine corpse being found and brought ashore. He reported to London duly 3 or 4 days later, yes, a body has been found, and we've been contacted by the Spanish Admiralty with word that this body has been found. Apparently it crashed in a Catalina. There was a Catalina seaplane, rubber boat, dinghy found floating not far away from the body. That too had been pushed out through the torpedo tube of the submarine to create the image. And then, of course, the anxious wait. Will the Spanish do the decent thing and turn over the body untouched, or will they open that case? Eventually, the case was handed back. I mean, very obligingly, the courier had the key to the case in his other pocket. The case was handed back by the Spanish authorities to the British naval attaché in Madrid. And they opened it, and there were all the letters still inside, and they were still sealed. So the question was, had the Japanese got hold of the documents inside and resealed them by magic or not? And 5 days later, Churchill is in Washington. This is May the 21st, 1943, the day of that telephone intercept. And he gets a message sent by pouch across from sea, one of these blue letters. This Operation Mincemeat was the name of the actual operation. And the message said very briefly, Operation Mincemeat, the enemy has swallowed the bait. Because the code breakers in Britain had intercepted messages going down the fish channel, the Geheimschreiber, from Berlin down to the outposts in Greece and in Sardinia, warning that the British were going to be invading and that certain secret documents had fallen into the hands of the German Abwehr. But there's a rider to this. Who believed these documents? Well, if you read the Goebbels diary, you see Goebbels says to Admiral Canaris, I don't believe these documents may be genuine, they may be a plant. And Admiral Canaris says there's not the slightest question of that. We've gone into this most thoroughly. It turned out the Gestapo did carry out checks in London. And they did find out that the dance hall had held a dance that night. So everything about that body was absolutely kosher, if you can put it like that. It would be so tasteless to put it like that. But hey, if you can't be tasteless here, where can you be tasteless? And it came up at Hitler's conference headquarters a few days later. Canaris says to Hitler, we have the stenographic record of that day. Canaris says to Hitler, we have received an extraordinarily welcome piece of vital information that's come from the body of a British courier that's been washed ashore, revealing that the target of the operation isn't Sicily but somewhere else. And we've taken all the necessary preparations. And the stenographic record shows Hitler just registering this fact, taking note of it. But I spoke with the stenographer who was at that conference, Ludwig Krieger. Now, Ludwig Krieger, who after the war resumed his duty as a conference stenographer and became eventually very highly paid verbatim stenographer of the German Bundestag, the German parliament. He lived in Bonn, and I visited him, and he still had all his old shorthand diaries and everything. In the First World War, he'd been actually the private secretary of the head of the German Secret Service then, the famous Colonel Nicolai. Once again, the German archivists, the German historians had paid not the slightest attention to this man, Ludwig Krieger. But he sat for 2 days dictating onto tape for me his reminiscences. Ludwig Krieger said, I remember so clearly that day when Canaris told the Führer about the find, the corpse, the courier. And I remember that as Hitler, I was longing to say to Hitler, to the chief, but this may be a plant, this smells very fishy, the whole thing stinks. But of course, as a stenographer, he could no way could he interrupt the conference and say this to the supreme head of the Third Reich. And then he said, I remember that as he was leaving the conference room, Hitler turned round and he said, Übrigens, Herr Christian, by the way, Mr. Christian, this is the chief of staff of the German Air Force at that time, by the way, Colonel Christian, I think this thing stinks. I think könnte es nicht, I think it's a plant. So Hitler, with his very sound instinct, although all the signs, this intense effort by the British Secret Service to create the phony identity of the man, the corpse, and everything else, something at the back of Hitler's mind, he disregarded this thing that had been given him on a plate, and he thought himself, no, the obvious next step is Sicily, surely. Not the far end, not Sardinia, it's got to be Sicily. This is dumb. But the German armed forces took it the other way. It was put to them on a plate, and they abandoned thought about Husky, as it was called, the British operation. landing in Sicily in July 1943, and they were taken totally by surprise when it began. Just like Normandy, 1944. Hitler said the invasion is going to be in Normandy, or Brest, that peninsula, and the German High Command said, oh no, it's going to be coming through Calais, through the narrow straits of Calais. And although Hitler ordered the 7th Army in Normandy, had to get all the reinforcements and had to be the one that was ready for the invasion, the German High Command knew better. And quietly, it disregarded its instructions and reinforced the Calais area instead, the 15th Army. Very interesting when you look at Hitler's own personal involvement, which I know about because I spoke to all his staff and I've read all the telegrams at that level. I think that's all we have time for on this particular subject, ladies and gentlemen. Have a break now. Professor Martin is here to talk to us after the break on this highly interesting subject of the slave trade and its origins. 10-15 minute break. Thank you very much indeed.